When the carriage door slammed shut behind her, Eliza Whitmore knew she had just sold her soul to the devil himself. Outside, London whispered her name with pity, the fallen heiress who'd lost everything in one brutal winter. Inside, Duke Adrian Blackthorne sat across from her, silent as a tomb, his reputation for cruelty preceding him like a funeral march. She was 23, penniless, and desperate. He was 35, merciless and in need of an heir. This wasn't a fairy tale. This was survival. And if you want to see how a woman with nothing but courage rebuilt an empire from ashes, stay until the end. Tell me in the comments what city you're watching from, and don't forget to hit that like button. Now, let me take you back to where it all began, the winter that destroyed everything Eliza thought she knew about the world. The first crack in Eliza Whitmore's carefully constructed world came not with thunder but with the soft click of a closing door. She stood in the drawing room of what had been her family's London townhouse, watching Mr. Pemberton, their solicitor of 15 years, gather his papers with the mechanical efficiency of a man who delivered bad news too many times to let it affect him anymore. The February afternoon light filtered through windows that would soon belong to someone else, casting long shadows across furniture already marked with auction tags. "I don't understand," Eliza said, though that was a lie. She understood perfectly, she just couldn't accept it yet. Father was meticulous with finances. He always said we were secure. Pemberton's expression softened slightly, the first hint of genuine emotion he'd shown since arriving an hour earlier. "Your father was many things, Miss Whitmore. Meticulous was not among them. The debts have been accumulating for years. The investments in the railway scheme, the merchant ships that never returned, the loans to friends who've since fled to the continent." He paused, seeming to choose his next words carefully. The scandal with Lord Ashford's wife was merely the final nail in a coffin, already built. Eliza's cheeks burned. The scandal. Of course. As if the debts weren't enough. Her father had to die in another man's bed, creating a social catastrophe that no amount of money could have repaired. But they didn't have any money anyway, so the point was moot. "How much time do I have?" she asked. "The house must be vacated by month's end. That gives you 2 weeks." Pemberton stood, his chair scraping against hardwood that her grandfather had imported from America. "I've prepared a list of respectable positions you might consider. Teaching, perhaps, or a companion to an elderly lady. With your education and bearing, get out." The words came out sharper than she'd intended, but Pemberton didn't flinch. He'd probably expected it. He simply nodded, collected his leather case, and walked toward the door. He paused at the threshold, not turning back. "I am sorry, Miss Whitmore. Truly. Your father was a difficult man, but he loved you very much. Of that, I'm certain." Then he was gone, and Eliza was alone in a house that felt suddenly, terribly empty. The silence pressed against her ears like water. She'd grown up in this house, walked these halls, learned to dance in this very drawing room. Her mother had died here when Eliza was 12, consumed by fever despite every doctor in London trying to save her. Her father had grown distant after that, spending more and more time at his club, making investments that Eliza now understood had been increasingly desperate attempts to restore what he was steadily losing. She walked to the window and looked out at the street. London in February was a study in gray. Gray buildings, gray sky, gray slush in the gutters. A few pedestrians hurried past, bundled against the cold. None of them looked up at her window. Why would they? She was already a ghost. The knocker sounded, sharp and insistent. Eliza's heart leapt with irrational hope. Perhaps it was a mistake. Perhaps Pemberton had forgotten something, or discovered an error in the calculations, or... She opened the door herself. There were no servants left to do it. They'd all fled within days of her father's death, taking what wages they could claim and vanishing like smoke. Only Mrs. Henshaw, the elderly cook, had stayed behind, and she'd left this morning with tears in her eyes and an apology Eliza had barely been able to hear over the rushing in her own ears. Standing on her doorstep was Richard Thornberry, her fiancé. Former fiancé, she corrected herself, seeing the look on his face. "Richard." She stepped back to let him in, but he remained on the threshold, as if crossing into her house might contaminate him. "I won't stay," he said. His voice was clipped, formal, the voice he used with servants or tradesmen. "I've come only to deliver this in person. It seemed the decent thing to do." He held out a letter. Eliza took it with numb fingers, though she already knew what it would say. The paper was expensive, the seal was his family's crest, and the weight of it told her he'd written more than a simple sentence or two. He'd probably agonized over the wording, she thought with bitter amusement. Richard always did pride himself on his eloquence. "I see," she said quietly. "Eliza, you must understand. The circumstances—" He faltered, looking genuinely pained, which was something. "My family's position, the scandal. It's not just about the money, though that's catastrophic enough. It's about what people will say, what they already are saying. My mother fainted when she heard about your father, and Lady Ashford. Fainted. My father says a connection to your family now would ruin any chance I have at advancement, and he's right. You know he's right." "I know," Eliza said, "because what else was there to say?" He was right. In the eyes of London society, she was poison now. The daughter of a debtor and an adulterer, left with nothing but shame and an empty house. "I did care for you," Richard continued, and he seemed to want her to believe it. "I want you to know that. If circumstances were different, but they're not." "No." He looked relieved that she wasn't going to make this difficult. "I've included information about a position in my letter. My aunt in Yorkshire needs a governess for her younger children. It's respectable work, and she's agreed not to be too particular about recent events. If you write to her, I'm certain she'll—" "Thank you, Richard. That's very kind." It wasn't kind. It was pity dressed up as charity, but it was also more than she'd expected from him, so she supposed she should be grateful. Richard had always been weak, but he wasn't cruel. Just weak. And weakness, she was learning, could be just as destructive as cruelty when survival was at stake. He nodded, eager to leave now that his duty was discharged. "I wish you well, Eliza." "Truly." Then he was gone, walking quickly down the steps and into a waiting carriage that bore his family's crest on the door. She watched him leave, letter still clutched in her hand, and felt absolutely nothing. The tears came later that night, as she sat alone in her bedroom wearing 3 shawls because there was no coal for the fireplace. She cried for her father, who she'd loved despite his flaws. She cried for her mother, taken too soon. She cried for the future she'd imagined. Marriage to Richard, children, a comfortable life in a comfortable house, in a comfortable neighborhood where nothing terrible ever happened. But mostly, she cried because she was terrified. By morning, she'd stopped crying. Tears solved nothing. She spent the next week selling everything that wasn't already claimed by creditors. The jewelry her mother had left her, the silver candlesticks, the books from her father's library, the dresses that had cost a fortune and now fetched pennies. She bargained with shopkeepers who smelled her desperation and drove prices down until she wanted to scream. She swallowed her pride and wrote to distant relatives, only to receive polite refusals wrapped in pretty language about their own financial constraints. The money she managed to gather wouldn't last a month. On the 10th day she sat in the kitchen, the only room she still heated, and then only barely, and spread the coins across the scarred wooden table. 3 pounds, 7 shillings, and a handful of pence. That was all that remained of the Whitmore fortune. She laughed, because crying seemed pointless now. The knock came just after dark. Eliza had learned to dread that sound. Knocks meant creditors or neighbors come to gawk, or former friends who weren't friends anymore but wanted to see how far she'd fallen. She'd stopped answering the door days ago, but this knock was different, authoritative. The kind of knock that said the person on the other side wouldn't be ignored. She opened the door a crack, keeping the chain latched. A man stood on her doorstep. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in black from head to toe. His face was hard angles and sharp edges, with eyes so dark they seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. He was perhaps 35, though his expression made him seem older, or perhaps ageless, like something carved from stone that had weathered centuries of storms without changing. "Miss Eliza Whitmore." His voice matched his appearance, cold, precise, with an edge that suggested he wasn't accustomed to being refused. "Who's asking?" "Duke Adrian Blackthorne. I've come to discuss a business matter. May I come in?" Every instinct Eliza possessed screamed at her to slam the door and bolt it. She knew that name. Everyone in London knew that name. The Duke of Blackthorne was a legend, and not the good kind. He'd inherited his title at 20 from a father who'd drunk himself to death, and in the 15 years since, he'd turned a crumbling estate into one of the wealthiest holdings in England through a combination of ruthless business dealings and complete disregard for social niceties. People whispered that he'd ruined 3 rival families who'd tried to block his expansion into shipping. They whispered that he'd bought up debts across London and then crushed the debtors without mercy. They whispered that his own mother had fled to the continent to escape him, and that his half-brother was the only person alive who could stand to be in the same room with him for more than an hour. They also whispered that he'd loved someone once, deeply and completely, but she'd died, and whatever capacity for human warmth he'd possessed had died with her. Eliza unlatched the chain and opened the door. She had nothing left to lose, and dangerous men were still better than the empty street. Blackthorn stepped inside without waiting for invitation, his gaze sweeping across the bare entrance hall with the efficiency of a general surveying a battlefield. He noted the empty hooks where paintings had hung, the darker squares on the wallpaper where furniture had stood, the dust gathering in corners that no servant remained to clean. "You've sold everything," he observed. It wasn't a question. "Not everything. I still have the house for another 4 days." "The house belongs to Lord Ashford as of yesterday. He accepted it in lieu of the debt your father owed him. You're currently trespassing." Eliza's stomach dropped, but she kept her face neutral. "I see. And has Lord Ashford sent you to expedite my departure?" "No." Blackthorn turned to face her fully, and for the first time she saw something almost like interest flicker in those dark eyes. "I've come on my own business. May we sit?" "The drawing room is empty, Your Grace. We can stand here, or we can sit in the kitchen. Those are your options." "The kitchen will do." She led him through the house, acutely aware of how each footstep echoed in rooms that had once been filled with life and music and light. The kitchen was marginally warmer than the rest of the house, thanks to the small fire she'd managed to coax from the last of the coal. She gestured to the table where her pathetic pile of coins still lay. Blackthorn sat without ceremony, his coat spreading around him like dark wings. Eliza remained standing, arms crossed, waiting. "I'll be direct," he said. "I need a wife. You need to avoid debtor's prison and starvation. I'm proposing a transaction." Of all the things Eliza had expected, it wasn't that. "Excuse me?" "I have lands, wealth, and position. What I lack is an heir, and English law being what it is, I require a wife to produce one. Every eligible woman in London either wants a love match, which I cannot provide, or comes with a family who will expect influence over my affairs. You have neither expectations nor family. You're educated, well-bred, despite recent circumstances, and desperate enough to be practical." Eliza stared at him, wondering if she'd misunderstood. But no, he was serious. Absolutely serious. "You're proposing marriage. I'm proposing a contract. You'll become Duchess of Blackthorn. You'll have wealth, security, and protection from your father's creditors. In exchange, you'll manage my household, appear at my side when necessary, and provide an heir. Beyond those requirements, your life will be your own." "And love?" The word felt foolish even as she said it, but she had to ask. Blackthorn's expression didn't change. "I don't believe in love, Miss Whitmore. I believe in mutually beneficial arrangements. This would be one." The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Eliza's mind raced. This was insane. He was offering her a lifeline, but at what cost? Marriage to a man with no heart, no warmth, no capacity for anything beyond cold calculation? She'd be trading one prison for another, poverty for a gilded cage. But she'd be alive, fed, safe. And perhaps that was all she could hope for now. "Why me?" she asked. "You could have anyone. Why choose a scandal-tainted woman with nothing?" "Because you have nothing," he replied simply. "That makes you less likely to betray me for gain, and the scandal doesn't concern me. I don't move in circles that would care, and those that would already hate me for other reasons." He stood, straightening to his full height. "I'll give you 1 hour to decide. My carriage is waiting outside. If you choose to accept, gather whatever you wish to bring and step into it. If not, I'll leave, and you'll never see me again." 1 hour? That's all the time you're giving me to decide the rest of my life? "You've already decided, Miss Whitmore. Now you're just fighting the inevitable." He walked to the kitchen door, then paused. For what it's worth, I'll treat you fairly. You'll want for nothing material, and I'll never raise a hand to you. I'm cold, not cruel. There's a difference." Then he was gone, his footsteps echoing through the empty house until the front door opened and closed with a sound like a coffin lid settling into place. Eliza sat down hard in the chair he'd vacated. Her hands were shaking. 1 hour. She looked around the kitchen, the only room in this entire house that still felt even remotely like home. In 4 days, she'd be thrown out with nowhere to go. Richard's aunt might take her on as a governess, but that was charity, and charity could be withdrawn on a whim. She'd be at the mercy of strangers for the rest of her life, always one mistake away from dismissal, always one illness away from destitution. Or she could marry the Duke of Blackthorn, a man who didn't believe in love, a man who wanted her only because she was desperate and disposable, a man whose reputation suggested he might be incapable of basic human warmth, but also a man who'd given her a choice, which was more than anyone else had done. Eliza thought of her mother, who'd married for love and died young. She thought of her father, who'd chased happiness through scandal and left nothing but ruin. She thought of Richard, who'd promised forever and delivered it in writing as a dismissal. Love hadn't saved any of them. Maybe practicality could save her. She stood and walked upstairs to her bedroom. She had very little left. Most of her dresses had been sold, her jewelry was gone, her books scattered to collectors. But there were a few things she couldn't bear to part with. Her mother's wedding ring, which she'd hidden from creditors. A miniature portrait of her parents on their wedding day. A journal her father had kept when he was young, before life had disappointed him. She packed them carefully in the one trunk she still owned, along with her remaining clothes. The entire process took less than 30 minutes. Then she sat on her bed, the bed she'd slept in since childhood, and waited. The church bells struck the hour. Eliza stood, lifted her trunk, it was light, there was so little left, and walked downstairs. She didn't look back at the room she was leaving. Looking back would make her doubt, and doubt would trap her here until the creditors came. She opened the front door. The Duke's carriage waited at the curb, black and gleaming and utterly imposing. A driver sat up top, statue still. The door was closed. Eliza walked down the steps, her trunk bumping against her leg. She reached the carriage and paused, hand on the door handle. This was it. The moment everything changed, she could still walk away. She could go to Richard's aunt, beg for the governess position, live a quiet life of subservience and anonymity. It wouldn't be much, but it would be hers. Or she could step into this carriage and become something else entirely. The door opened from inside. Blackthorn sat in shadow, barely visible, but his voice was clear. "Have you decided?" Eliza looked back at the house one last time. Every window was dark. It looked abandoned already, like she'd never lived there at all. She climbed into the carriage and pulled the door shut behind her. The driver cracked the reins and they lurched into motion. Eliza sat across from the Duke, her trunk at her feet, her heart hammering so hard she thought he must be able to hear it. "A wise choice," Blackthorn said. "I haven't agreed to anything yet." "You're in my carriage." "That's agreement enough." He produced a folded document from his coat. "This is the contract. It outlines your duties and rights as my wife. Read it. We'll sign it before the ceremony." "When is the ceremony?" "Tomorrow morning. I've already secured a license." "Tomorrow?" Eliza's voice came out strangled. "That's impossible." "It's expedient. The longer we wait, the more opportunity for complications. You'll stay at my London residence tonight, and we'll marry at dawn. By noon, we'll be on our way to Blackthorn Hall." "You've planned all this already." "I'm a man who values efficiency, Miss Whitmore. I don't make decisions lightly, and once made, I don't delay in executing them." Eliza took the contract with trembling hands. It was written in dense legal language, but the core terms were clear enough. She would become his wife in name and fact. She would manage his household and bear his children. In exchange, she would receive an annual allowance of £2,000, control over household expenditures, and legal protection from all her father's debts. It was more money than she'd ever imagined having. It was also a price on her freedom. "What if I can't bear children?" she asked. "Then we'll deal with that when it becomes relevant. I'm not a monster, Miss Whitmore. If you're barren through no fault of your own, I won't cast you out. The contract will stand." "And if you die? What becomes of me?" "You'll be provided for." The estate includes a dower house where you may live in comfort for the rest of your life, with a generous pension. It's all detailed in Clause 17. Eliza read Clause 17. Then she read the entire contract again, looking for traps, for hidden cruelties, for anything that might destroy her. She found nothing but cold, mechanical fairness. He was offering her a business arrangement, nothing more and nothing less. "I want one addition," she said. Blackthorn raised an eyebrow. "Oh?" "I want it stated explicitly that you will never take a mistress while we're married. If this is to be a business arrangement, then it will be an exclusive one. I won't be humiliated the way my mother was." Something flickered in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or maybe respect. "Your mother was unfaithful?" "My father was. Repeatedly. She knew, and it killed her slowly. I won't live that way." Blackthorn was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Agreed. I have no interest in mistresses anyway. They require attention I'm unwilling to give." He produced a pen from his coat. "Anything else?" "No." "Then sign." Eliza hesitated one final time. The carriage rolled through London streets, carrying her farther and farther from everything she'd known. Outside, the city was a blur of lights and shadows. Inside, a cold man waited for her to seal her fate. She signed. Blackthorn took the contract, added his own signature below hers, and tucked it away. "Welcome to your new life, Miss Whitmore. I suggest you rest. Tomorrow will be a long day." They rode the rest of the way in silence. The Duke's London residence was a massive townhouse in Mayfair, 4 stories of pale stone and black iron, with windows that blazed with light. Servants appeared the moment the carriage stopped, taking Eliza's trunk, ushering her inside with professional efficiency. A stern-faced woman who introduced herself as Mrs. Crawford, the housekeeper, showed Eliza to a bedroom on the 3rd floor. "His Grace has instructed me to provide you with anything you require," Mrs. Crawford said. "A bath is being drawn. Supper will be sent up within the hour. If you need clothing for tomorrow's ceremony, I can have a modiste sent for." "That won't be necessary," Eliza said faintly. She had one decent dress left, a dark blue wool that had been too plain to sell. It would have to do. Mrs. Crawford nodded and withdrew, leaving Eliza alone in a room larger than her entire kitchen had been. The bed was enormous, covered in silk. A fire roared in the grate. Through a connecting door she could see the bathroom, where steam rose from a copper tub. She should feel relieved, grateful even. Instead, she felt numb. Eliza bathed mechanically, put on the nightgown that had been laid out for her, finer than anything she'd ever owned, and climbed into bed. The sheets were soft. The mattress was perfect. The room was warm. She'd never felt more alone in her life. Sleep came eventually, fitful and full of dreams where she was drowning in cold water while Richard watched from shore, shaking his head in disappointment. She woke to gray dawn light and the sound of rain against windows. Mrs. Crawford appeared with breakfast on a tray and the news that the ceremony would take place at 8 o'clock in the private chapel attached to the house. There would be no guests beyond the required witnesses, a decision Eliza was grateful for. The idea of standing before a crowd and promising to love a man she barely knew would have been unbearable. At 7:30, she dressed in her blue wool dress and braided her hair in a simple coronet. She looked in the mirror and saw a stranger, too pale, too thin, eyes too large in a face that seemed to belong to someone much older. "You can do this?" she whispered to her reflection. "You're stronger than you think." Her reflection didn't look convinced. At 8 o'clock precisely, Mrs. Crawford escorted her downstairs to the chapel. It was a small room, dimly lit, with stained glass windows that turned the gray morning light into something almost beautiful. Blackthorn stood at the altar in a black suit, his expression unreadable. A priest waited beside him, looking vaguely uncomfortable, and 2 servants stood as witnesses. No one smiled. Eliza walked down the short aisle, feeling like she was walking to her own execution. When she reached Blackthorn's side, he took her hand. His grip was firm and cold, and the ceremony began. The priest spoke words about love and devotion and eternal union. Blackthorn repeated them in a flat monotone, as if reading from a shopping list. When it was Eliza's turn, her voice came out barely above a whisper. "I, Eliza Margaret Whitmore, take thee, Adrian Charles Blackthorn, to be my wedded husband." The words felt like lies, but she spoke them anyway. When the priest pronounced them man and wife, Blackthorn kissed her cheek, a brief, passionless brush of lips against skin, and it was done. She was a duchess now. "We leave for Blackthorn Hall in 1 hour," her new husband said, his first words to her as his wife. "The journey will take most of the day. I suggest you eat something before we depart." Then he walked away, leaving her standing at the altar with the priest and the witnesses, all of whom looked as uncomfortable as she felt. Mrs. Crawford appeared at her elbow. "Come, Your Grace, I'll help you prepare for the journey." Your Grace. The title sounded absurd. The carriage that awaited them was even more luxurious than the one from the night before. Plush seats, thick curtains, foot warmers that made the interior almost cozy despite the rain hammering against the roof. Eliza settled into her corner while Blackthorn took his, and they set off north. For the first hour, neither spoke. Eliza watched the city give way to countryside, bare trees and muddy fields stretching in every direction under a sky the color of old pewter. The rain never let up. It matched her mood perfectly. "You should know what to expect," Blackthorn said finally, breaking the silence. "Blackthorn Hall is isolated. The nearest village is 5 miles away, and London is a full day's journey. The estate is large, nearly 10,000 acres, but most of it is farmland or forest. The house itself is old, drafty, and in constant need of repair despite my best efforts." "It sounds delightful," Eliza said dryly. His lips twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. "It's tolerable. You'll have your own quarters, naturally. I've instructed the staff to prepare the Duchess's wing. You'll find it adequate." "How generous." This time he did smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "You have a sharp tongue, Lady Blackthorn." "Good. You'll need it." "Why?" "Because Blackthorn Hall is not a kind place," he said simply. "The land is harsh, the people are harder, and I am not a warm host. If you expect comfort beyond the material, you'll be disappointed." "I expect nothing, Your Grace. That way I can't be disappointed." He studied her for a long moment, those dark eyes seeming to see straight through her careful composure. "You're stronger than you look," he said finally. "That's good. Weakness doesn't survive at Blackthorn." Then he turned back to the window and the conversation was over. They stopped twice, once to change horses, once for a brief meal at a coaching inn where the innkeeper nearly tripped over himself bowing to the Duke. Blackthorn spoke to no one beyond what was necessary, and Eliza followed his lead, too exhausted to make polite conversation with strangers. By the time they turned onto the private road that led to Blackthorn Hall, night had fallen. Eliza had been dozing fitfully, her head bouncing against the carriage wall with every rut in the road. The sudden change in the quality of darkness woke her. She looked out the window and saw lights in the distance, dozens of them, burning against the night like fallen stars. "We're here," Blackthorn said unnecessarily. As they drew closer, the house revealed itself in pieces. First the gates, massive iron things that groaned as they swung open. Then the drive, lined with leafless trees that looked like skeletal hands reaching toward the sky. And finally, the house itself. Blackthorn Hall was enormous, Gothic, forbidding. It sprawled across the landscape like a sleeping giant, all gray stone and sharp angles and towers that seemed to claw at the clouds. Light spilled from dozens of windows, but somehow that made it seem colder, not warmer, like looking at a skull with candles burning in its eye sockets. "Welcome home," Blackthorn said, and Eliza couldn't tell if he was being sincere or sarcastic. The carriage stopped before a massive front entrance. Servants appeared, forming 2 lines, a formal reception for the new Duchess. Eliza stepped down, her legs stiff from hours of travel, and found herself facing what seemed like an army of staff. Housemaids, footmen, gardeners, stable hands, all standing at attention in the rain, all staring at her with expressions ranging from curiosity to frank skepticism. An elderly man stepped forward, his back ramrod straight despite his age. "Welcome to Blackthorn Hall, Your Grace. I am Harrison, the butler. We are honored to serve you." "Thank you, Harrison," Eliza managed. Her voice sounded small against the vastness of the house looming behind him. Blackthorn appeared at her side. "Lady Blackthorn is tired from the journey. Show her to her quarters. She'll meet the household properly tomorrow. Of course, Your Grace. Eliza followed Harrison into the house, through an entrance hall that could have swallowed her entire childhood home, up a grand staircase, down a corridor that seemed to stretch for miles. Paintings of stern-faced blackthorns stared down at her from the walls. Suits of armor stood in alcoves like silent guards. The air smelled of old wood and older stone. Finally, Harrison opened a door and stood aside. "The Duchess's quarters, Your Grace." Eliza stepped inside and stopped. The rooms were beautiful. There was no other word for it. A sitting room with furniture upholstered in deep green velvet. A bedroom with a canopy bed that looked like something from a fairy tale. A dressing room filled with empty wardrobes waiting to be filled. A private bathroom with modern plumbing, and a tub even larger than the one in London. But beautiful wasn't the same as warm. The rooms were spotless, perfectly appointed, and utterly impersonal. They could have belonged to anyone, or no one. There was nothing here that suggested a real person had ever lived in them, loved in them, cried in them. "His Grace's quarters are in the East Wing," Harrison said quietly. "These rooms have been vacant since the late Duchess passed 20 years ago. We've done our best to prepare them, but if anything is not to your satisfaction, you need only say so." "They're lovely." "Thank you, Harrison." He bowed and withdrew, leaving her alone. Eliza walked slowly through the rooms, touching things, the curtains, the furniture, the cold fireplace waiting to be lit. A maid appeared silently, offering to help her undress, but Eliza dismissed her. She needed to be alone. She found her trunk in the dressing room, already unpacked. Her few dresses hung in the massive wardrobe like orphans in a cathedral. Her mother's wedding ring sat on the vanity, looking tiny and fragile next to the silver brushes and crystal bottles that had been provided. She picked up the ring and slipped it onto her finger. It was too loose. She'd lost weight these past weeks, but wearing it made her feel less alone. A soft knock at the door made her turn. "Come in," she called. The door opened, revealing not a servant, but Duke Blackthorne himself. He'd changed out of his traveling clothes into something more casual, dark trousers and a white shirt open at the collar. It was the first time she'd seen him looking anything less than perfectly formal, and it made him seem almost human. Almost. "I wanted to ensure you had everything you needed," he said from the doorway. He didn't enter, she noticed, maintaining the boundaries of their arrangement even now. "I'm quite comfortable, thank you." "Good." He hesitated, seeming to search for words, an unusual state for a man who'd been so coldly articulate until now. "This isn't what you imagined for your life." It wasn't a question, but Eliza answered anyway. "No, it's not." "It's not what I imagined for mine either," he said quietly, "but we make do with what we're given. You'll find that's a useful skill here." "Is that what you do, Your Grace? Make do?" His expression hardened. "I survive, Lady Blackthorne, and I ensure that those under my protection survive as well. That includes you now." He straightened, the moment of vulnerability, if that's what it had been, passing. "Breakfast is at 8. We keep country hours here. If you need anything before then, ring for a servant." "Will you be at breakfast?" "I have business to attend to in the morning. You'll breakfast alone." Of course she would. He turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing. You'll likely meet my half-brother soon. His name is Lucas. He's difficult. Pay him no mind." Then he was gone, the door closing with a soft click that somehow sounded like a cell door locking. Eliza stood in the center of her beautiful, empty rooms and realized with perfect, terrible clarity what she'd done. She'd escaped poverty and scandal, yes. She'd secured her future, yes. But she'd traded one form of death for another. Outside, the rain continued to fall, drumming against the windows of Blackthorne Hall like fingers trying to get in, or like prisoners trying to get out. The morning arrived with the same relentless gray that had welcomed Eliza the night before. She woke disoriented, her body still expecting the familiar creaks of her old house, the particular quality of London light through worn curtains. Instead, she found herself in a bed so large she'd barely disturbed the covers, in a room so cold her breath misted in the air. The fire had died overnight. No one had come to tend it. She dressed quickly in the warmest dress she owned, her fingers clumsy with cold as she fastened the buttons. The mirror showed her a woman who looked like a ghost, pale skin, dark circles under her eyes, hair that refused to cooperate without a lady's maid to tame it. She managed a simple braid and decided that would have to suffice. The clock on the mantel read 8:30. She'd missed breakfast, assuming anyone had actually expected her to attend. Eliza opened her door and stepped into the corridor, immediately regretting it. If her rooms were cold, the hallway was arctic. The vast house seemed designed to drain warmth rather than retain it, with high ceilings that swallowed heat and stone floors that radiated chill through the soles of her slippers. She wandered for 20 minutes before finding the main staircase again. Blackthorn Hall was a labyrinth, corridors branching into corridors, rooms opening onto rooms, staircases that seemed to lead nowhere. She passed servants occasionally, each of whom bobbed a curtsy or tugged a forelock before hurrying past without meeting her eyes. Their expressions ranged from curious to wary, but none were welcoming. Finally, she found what appeared to be a breakfast room, though the sideboard was empty and the table cleared. A maid was polishing silver in the corner, her movements mechanical and precise. "Excuse me," Eliza said, and the girl jumped as if she'd been struck. "Your Grace, I didn't hear you come in." She set down the silver with a clatter, her cheeks flushing. "I'm sorry, the breakfast service ended at 9. Cook didn't think... That is, we weren't told to expect." "It's quite all right," Eliza interrupted, taking pity on the girl's obvious distress. "I'm not familiar with the household schedule yet. Could you tell me where I might find the Duke?" "His Grace rode out at dawn, ma'am. He won't be back until evening, most like. He's inspecting the north fields with the steward." "I see. And is there anyone else in the house I might speak with?" The maid hesitated, glancing toward the window. "Mr. Lucas is about somewhere. He's usually in the library this time of morning, or the conservatory if he's in a mood." "Mr. Lucas, the Duke's half-brother?" "Yes, Your Grace." The maid's expression suggested that was all the information Eliza would get, and perhaps all she should want. Eliza thanked her and left, her stomach growling. She'd eaten almost nothing the day before, too nervous to keep food down, and now she was paying for it. But the idea of ringing for a servant and demanding a meal felt wrong somehow. She was the Duchess, yes, but she didn't feel like one. She felt like an intruder who'd wandered into someone else's house and was desperately trying not to get caught. The library wasn't difficult to find. It occupied an entire wing of the house, 3 stories of books accessible by a series of wrought iron walkways and spiral staircases. It would have been magnificent if it hadn't been so cold. Eliza could see her breath as she stepped inside, and the books themselves seemed to huddle on their shelves like refugees from warmth. A man sat in a leather chair near one of the tall windows, his feet propped on an ottoman, a book in one hand and a glass of amber liquid in the other. He looked up as she entered, and Eliza caught her breath. He was beautiful. There was no other word for it. Where Adrian Blackthorn was all harsh angles and brutal efficiency, this man was curves and light. Golden hair that fell across his forehead, eyes the color of summer sky, a smile that came easily and reached all the way to those eyes. He couldn't have been more than 25, and he looked like he'd never had a serious thought in his life. "Well, well," he said, setting down his glass and unfolding from the chair with careless grace. "The mysterious bride. I was wondering when you'd turn up. Mr. Blackthorn, I presume." "Lucas, please, we're family now, after all." He crossed the room and took her hand, raising it to his lips in a gesture that would have seemed absurd from anyone else, but somehow worked when he did it. "Welcome to the frozen waste we call home. I hope Adrian warned you about the heating situation. No? How typical." Despite herself, Eliza smiled. "He mentioned the house was drafty." "Drafty. Yes. That's one word for it. Uninhabitable is another. Soul-crushing is a third." Lucas released her hand and gestured toward the chair he'd vacated. "Sit, please. You look like you're about to collapse, and I'd hate for Adrian to accuse me of killing his wife through neglect on her first full day here." Eliza sat gratefully, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Lucas disappeared for a moment and returned with a second glass of whatever he'd been drinking. He pressed it into her hands. "Whiskey," he said. "Not what the doctor ordered for breakfast, but it'll warm you faster than tea, and frankly, warmth is the priority in this mausoleum." She took a sip and gasped as fire burned down her throat. Lucas laughed, not unkindly. "You'll get used to it. Everyone does eventually. It's the only way to survive a winter at Blackthorn Hall. Drink steadily and avoid the north wing entirely." Why the North Wing? Because that's where Adrian keeps his ghosts. Lucas said it lightly, but something in his eyes suggested he wasn't entirely joking. He settled into the chair opposite hers, crossing his long legs. So, tell me, what possessed you to marry my brother? And don't say love. I won't believe you, and you'll insult my intelligence. Eliza considered lying, then decided against it. This man seemed to see through pretense the way glass sees through light. Desperation, she said simply. He offered survival. I accepted. Honest. I like that. Lucas took a long drink from his glass. Most women would have dressed it up as duty or gratitude or some other noble sentiment. But you understand what this is. A transaction. That's wise. Adrian doesn't do sentiment. So I've noticed. Has he been perfectly horrible to you? No, don't answer. I can see it in your face. Let me guess. He's been coldly polite, utterly distant, and about as warm as the marble in the entrance hall. That's accurate. Lucas sighed. He wasn't always like this, you know. Once upon a time, my brother was almost human. He laughed. He cared about things. He had friends, even. What changed? The lightness drained from Lucas's expression like water from a broken glass. Our sister died. Isabel. She was 10 years younger than Adrian, 5 years younger than me. Sweetest creature you ever met. All sunshine and music and hope. She lived in this house, ran through these very halls, and somehow she made the whole place feel warm. He stared into his glass. She got sick, scarlet fever. Adrian brought in every doctor in England, spent a fortune trying to save her. Nothing worked. She died in the North Wing, in the room where she was born, and something in Adrian died with her. Eliza felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. When did this happen? 6 years ago. I was 19, reckless and stupid. Adrian was 29, already the Duke for nearly a decade. He'd raised Isabel himself after our father drank himself to death, and our mother fled to Italy. She was his whole world. Lucas met her eyes. After she died, he locked her rooms and never entered them again. He dismissed half the staff, sold off 3 estates, and turned himself into the ice sculpture you married. The business dealings got more ruthless. The social connections got severed. And anyone who tried to reach him emotionally got frozen out. Including you? Especially me. I remind him too much of what we lost. Lucas's smile returned, but it was brittle now. So I drink, and I read, and I try not to care that my brother has turned into a stranger who tolerates my presence only because we share blood. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the story settling over them like snow. Eliza thought about the man who'd offered her a contract instead of a marriage, who'd kissed her cheek like he was signing a document, who'd warned her that Blackthorn Hall was not a kind place. Suddenly she understood why. He loved her very much, she said quietly. He loved her so much it broke him when she died. And broken things don't heal, Lady Blackthorn. They just learn to function around the damage. The door to the library banged open with enough force to make them both jump. A woman stormed in, 50-something, dressed in severe black, with iron-gray hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her face. She stopped when she saw Eliza, her expression curdling into something between disgust and fury. "So it's true," the woman said. Her voice could have cut glass. He actually went through with it, brought home a scandal-tainted nobody, and called her Duchess. Lucas stood smoothly, placing himself slightly between Eliza and the newcomer. "Mrs. Blackthorn, how lovely to see you. I thought you were still in Bath, terrorizing the spa staff." "Don't be impertinent, Lucas. This is serious." The woman, Mrs. Blackthorn, though Eliza had no idea what relation she was, fixed her with a stare that could have frozen water. "I am Constance Blackthorn, widow of Adrian's uncle. I've managed this household for 6 years since Isabel's death. Who are you to sweep in and displace me?" Eliza stood as well, drawing on reserves of composure she hadn't known she possessed. "I'm Eliza Blackthorn, the Duke's wife, and I have no intention of displacing anyone." "The Duke's wife?" Constance spat the words like poison. "A girl whose father died in another man's bed and whose family name is now synonymous with scandal. Do you know what people are saying in London? That Adrian has finally lost his mind, that he's brought shame upon the Blackthorn name by marrying a That's enough. Lucas's voice cracked like a whip, all trace of lightness gone. You forget yourself, Aunt. Lady Blackthorn is the Duchess now, whether you approve or not. Adrian made his choice, and your opinion on the matter is neither requested nor relevant. Adrian made a catastrophic mistake, and it's my duty to this family to say so. Constance turned back to Eliza, her lip curling. You may have trapped him into marriage, girl, but don't think for a moment you belong here. This house has standards, it has history, it has dignity. You bring nothing but disgrace. Something hot and sharp flared in Eliza's chest, rage or hurt, or maybe just exhaustion with being judged by people who knew nothing about her. She took a step forward, lifting her chin. You're right, she said quietly. I bring no ancient lineage, no spotless reputation, no family fortune. I bring only what I am, a woman who has survived the worst year of her life and come out the other side still standing. If that's not enough for you, Mrs. Blackthorn, I suggest you take your concerns to your nephew. I'm sure he'll be very interested to hear them. Constance's face went purple. How dare you? How dare I what? Speak honestly? Refuse to be intimidated? I've been judged by better people than you, madam, and I've stopped caring what they think. Your approval means nothing to me. For a long moment, Constance simply stared at her, seemingly unable to process this resistance from someone she'd clearly expected to crumble. Then she turned on her heel and stalked out, her skirts whipping behind her like storm clouds. The door slammed. The sound echoed through the library like a gunshot. Lucas let out a low whistle. Well, that was spectacular. Welcome to Blackthorn Hall, where the family is dysfunctional and the house guests are hostile. Eliza's hands were shaking. She sat down hard, the adrenaline draining away and leaving her hollow. Is she always like that? Constance? Oh, that was her being polite. Wait until she really gets going. Lucas refilled both their glasses. She's been running this place like her personal fiefdom since Isabel died. Adrian let her because he couldn't bear to be involved, and she's taken that as license to act like she owns the estate. Your arrival threatens her power, so naturally, she's going to make your life as difficult as possible. Wonderful. Anything else I should know? The staff is loyal to her, not to you. She controls the household accounts, the menus, the schedules, everything. If you try to change anything, you'll face a wall of resistance. He paused. But you stood up to her just now, which is more than most people manage. That counts for something. It counts for making an enemy. You already had an enemy. Now she just knows you're not easy prey. Eliza drained her glass, the whiskey burning away the last of her shock. She'd been at Blackthorn Hall less than 24 hours and had already made a powerful adversary. Wonderful. Perfect. Exactly what she needed. The door opened again, more quietly this time. Harrison, the butler, stepped inside with the careful neutrality of a man who'd perfected the art of seeing everything and acknowledging nothing. Your Grace, he said to Eliza, luncheon is being served in the small dining room. I've taken the liberty of having a tray prepared for you, given that you missed breakfast. Thank you, Harrison. Eliza stood, grateful for the escape. Is the Duke back? Not yet, Your Grace. He sent word that he'll return for dinner. Of course he did. Adrian Blackthorn was out inspecting fields, or meeting with stewards, or doing anything that kept him away from his new wife. Eliza couldn't even blame him. She'd have avoided herself, too, if she could. Lucas walked her to the dining room, keeping up a stream of light conversation that required little response. Stories about the estate, gossip about the neighbors, observations about the servants. Eliza appreciated it more than she could say. It felt normal, almost, like talking to a friend. The small dining room was still large enough to seat 12, with a table that gleamed like dark water and portraits of disapproving blackthorns glaring down from the walls. A single place had been set at one end with a tray of soup, bread, cold meat, and cheese. It looked delicious, but Eliza's stomach had knotted itself into something too tight to accept food. I'll leave you to it, Lucas said. But if you need anything, conversation, whiskey, an ally in the war against Aunt Constance, you know where to find me. Thank you, Lucas, for everything. He sketched a bow and left, and Eliza was alone again. She forced herself to eat, though everything tasted like dust. Outside the window, she could see the ground stretching away toward distant woods, bare trees, brown grass, gray sky. No color anywhere. It matched the inside of the house perfectly. She spent the afternoon exploring, mapping the house in her mind. The drawing room where dust covers shrouded furniture no one used. The conservatory where plants struggled to survive in the weak winter light. The music room with a pianoforte that looked like it hadn't been played in years. And finally, inevitably, the north wing. Harrison had mentioned it was off limits, but he hadn't said it was locked. Eliza stood in front of the door for a long time, her hand on the latch, debating. This was where Isabel had died. This was where Adrian kept his ghosts. She opened the door. The air inside was different, stale and still, like the house itself was holding its breath. Dust motes danced in the thin light filtering through curtained windows. The furniture was covered in white sheets, giving the rooms the appearance of a cemetery for abandoned things. Eliza walked slowly through a sitting room, a bedroom, a nursery still filled with toys that would never be played with again. Everything was preserved exactly as it had been, a shrine to a dead girl. On the nursery mantel, she found a miniature portrait of a child with dark hair and Adrian's eyes, smiling like she held the sun in her hands. Isabel. Looking at that smile, Eliza understood what Lucas had meant. This child had been everything warm and bright in a cold, dark house. Losing her would have been like losing light itself. You shouldn't be here. Eliza spun around, her heart hammering. Adrian stood in the doorway, still dressed in riding clothes. Mud splattered on his boots. His face was absolutely expressionless, but his eyes burned with something that might have been fury or might have been pain. I'm sorry, she said quickly. I didn't mean to intrude. I was exploring and the door was open. It should have been locked. He stepped into the room, moving with the careful control of a man restraining himself from violence. These rooms are private. No one enters them. Not the servants, not Lucas, not you. I understand. I'll leave. No. He crossed to the fireplace and picked up the portrait, his thumb brushing across the painted face with heartbreaking tenderness. You're here now. You might as well know. He was silent for a long moment. This was my sister, Isabel. She was 10 when she died. Lucas told me, I'm so sorry. Everyone's sorry. It changes nothing. He set the portrait down carefully, precisely. She was the only good thing in this house, the only person who could make me remember what it felt like to care about something beyond duty and obligation. When she died, I locked these rooms because I couldn't bear to see them empty. And I locked something in myself for the same reason. Liza took a step toward him, driven by an impulse she didn't fully understand. You can't live like this forever, locked away with ghosts. Can I? He turned to face her fully, and the emptiness in his expression was worse than any anger could have been. I made you a promise, Lady Blackthorn. I promised to provide for you, to protect you, to treat you fairly. But I never promised warmth. I never promised love. I don't have those things to give. They died here, in this room, 6 years ago. Then why marry at all? Why bring me here if you can't, if you won't? Because I need an heir, because the estate requires it, because duty demands it. His voice was flat, reciting facts. You knew this when you signed the contract. You agreed to it. I agreed to a marriage, not a mausoleum. The words burst out before she could stop them. I agreed to be your wife, not another ghost haunting these halls. Then what did you expect? For the first time, emotion cracked through his control, anger, raw and sharp. Did you think I'd fall in love with you? That we'd have some fairy tale transformation? I told you what this was. I was honest. You were honest about the terms, Eliza shot back. You didn't mention I'd be living in a tomb surrounded by people who hate me, serving a husband who can barely look at me, in a house that's slowly freezing me to death, both literally and metaphorically. They stared at each other across Isabel's nursery, two people bound by contract but separated by chasms of grief and fear and loneliness. The afternoon light was fading, turning the white-shrouded furniture into shapes that could have been anything, monuments or warnings, or the physical manifestations of all the words neither of them knew how to say. Finally, Adrian spoke, his voice tired. What do you want from me? I want you to try, Eliza said quietly. Not to love me. I'm not foolish enough to expect that, but to at least acknowledge I exist. To share a meal occasionally. To to speak to me as if I'm a person rather than a piece of furniture you've acquired. And if I can't, then we'll both spend the rest of our lives in this beautiful, terrible house, slowly turning into the ghosts your sister left behind. Something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, maybe, or fear. He looked around the nursery, at the toys and the portrait and the empty cradle. And for just a moment, Eliza saw him clearly. Not the ruthless duke or the cold husband, but a man who'd loved someone so completely that losing her had shattered him into pieces he didn't know how to reassemble. "I'll try," he said finally. The words sounded like they cost him everything. "I don't know if I can succeed, but I'll try." It wasn't much. It wasn't even close to enough. But it was more than she'd had an hour ago. "That's all I ask," Eliza said. Adrian nodded once, sharp and decisive, then strode past her toward the door. He paused at the threshold, not looking back. "We dine at 7. I'll expect you in the dining room." Then he was gone, his footsteps echoing away down the corridor, leaving Eliza alone in the room where hope had died and might have just taken its first gasping breath again. She looked at Isabel's portrait one more time, at that bright smile frozen forever in paint and memory. "I hope I'm strong enough for this," she whispered to the girl who couldn't answer. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, soft and silent and relentless. The snow continued through dinner, piling against the windows like silent accusations. Eliza sat at one end of the massive dining table, Adrian at the other, with 20 feet of polished mahogany stretching between them like a frozen lake neither dared to cross. He'd kept his word. He was here. But the silence was almost worse than his absence would have been. A servant placed soup before her, something rich and brown that steamed in the cold air. Eliza picked up her spoon, watching Adrian from the corner of her eye. He ate with mechanical precision, each movement controlled and exact, as if dining were a military operation rather than a meal. "How was your inspection?" she asked finally, unable to bear the quiet any longer. Adrian glanced up, seemingly surprised she'd spoken. "Productive. The north fields need drainage work before spring planting. The tenant farmers are concerned about grain prices." "I see." Silence fell again, broken only by the clink of silver against china. "Lucas mentioned you met Constance," Adrian said after a long pause. "Your aunt?" "Yes. We had a conversation." Harrison informed me it was more than a conversation. Something that might have been amusement flickered across his face. He said you faced her down like a general defending territory. She called me a scandal-tainted nobody. I simply clarified that her opinion was irrelevant. This time, Adrian's lips definitely twitched. "She's been trying to manage my life since my father died. I've allowed it because I didn't care enough to stop her. But she has no authority over you. If she oversteps again, you have my permission to remind her of that fact." It was the longest conversation they'd had since the wedding. Eliza felt something cautiously unfurl in her chest. Not hope, exactly, but something adjacent to it. "Thank you," she said. They finished the meal in more comfortable silence. When the servants cleared the plates, Adrian stood, and Eliza assumed he'd disappear to his study or his rooms. Instead, he hesitated. "Would you care to join me for coffee in the drawing room?" The request was so unexpected that Eliza nearly dropped her napkin. Yes. Thank you." The drawing room was one of the few spaces in Blackthorn Hall that felt remotely warm, with a fire blazing in the massive hearth and furniture that wasn't shrouded in dust covers. Adrian poured coffee from a silver service while Eliza settled into a chair near the fire, grateful for the heat. "This is civil of you," she said carefully. "You asked me to try." "I'm trying." He handed her a cup. "I'm not certain I'm doing it correctly." "There's no correct way to have a conversation, Your Grace." "Adrian," he said abruptly, "if we're to live together, you should use my name. Your Grace sounds like you're addressing a stranger." "We are strangers." "Then perhaps it's time we remedied that." He sat across from her, cradling his own cup. "Tell me something about yourself. Something that wasn't in the reports my solicitor provided." "You had me investigated?" "Of course. I don't make decisions without information." He must have seen something in her expression because he added, "The report was factual. It contained no gossip, no judgment, just circumstances." Eliza sipped her coffee, considering. What could she tell him that wouldn't sound pathetic? That she'd once dreamed of being a painter, but her father considered it frivolous? That she'd loved her fiancé until she realized he loved his social position more? That she was terrified every single day that she'd made a catastrophic mistake marrying a man who looked at her like she was a problem to be managed? I wanted to travel, she said finally. Before my mother died, we used to plan imaginary journeys. Paris in spring, Venice in summer, Vienna for the opera season. After she was gone, my father had no interest in going anywhere, and I had no means to go alone. So I read instead. Travel narratives, letters from abroad, anything that could take me somewhere beyond London. Adrian was quiet for a moment. Have you been anywhere at all? Bath, once. Brighton for a season. That's the extent of my adventures. Blackthorn Hall is hardly an improvement over Brighton. No, Eliza agreed, but it's honest about what it is. There's something to be said for that. They talked for another hour, carefully, like diplomats negotiating a treaty. He told her about the estate's history, the challenges of managing 10,000 acres, the politics of dealing with tenants and neighbors. She told him about her mother's love of music, her father's failed investments, the small rebellions of her childhood. Nothing deep, nothing that would require either of them to be vulnerable. But it was more than silence. It was a beginning. When the clock struck 10, Adrian stood. I have correspondence to attend to. Thank you for your company, Eliza. Her name and his voice sounded strange, but not entirely unpleasant. Good night, Adrian. He left, and Eliza sat alone by the fire, feeling something she hadn't felt since arriving at Blackthorn Hall, a faint, fragile sense that perhaps survival here might be possible after all. The feeling lasted exactly 3 days. On the 4th morning, Eliza woke to shouting in the courtyard. She rushed to her window and saw chaos below, servants running, horses stamping, and Lucas in the center of it all, his arm hanging at an unnatural angle, his face gray with pain. She didn't bother with propriety. She threw a dressing gown over her nightdress and ran downstairs, her bare feet slapping against cold stone. What happened? She demanded, reaching Lucas just as 2 footmen were trying to help him toward the house. Hunting accident, Lucas gasped. His usual bright smile was nowhere in evidence. Horse spooked. I fell. Arms broken, I think. Where's Adrian? Rode for the doctor. Hour away at least. Lucas swayed, and Eliza caught him, alarmed by how much he was leaning on her. Get him inside, she ordered the footman. Now! They carried him to his rooms, a suite in the West Wing that was, unsurprisingly, warmer and more lived in than most of the house. Eliza followed, her mind racing. An hour for the doctor, maybe longer if the roads were bad. Lucas was clearly in shock, his breathing shallow and rapid. Someone bring me hot water, clean linens, and brandy, she called. When no one moved, she turned to find Constance blocking the doorway, her expression glacial. Step aside, girl. This is not your concern. He's injured. Of course it's my concern. You're not a physician. You'll do more harm than good. Constance's voice dripped with contempt. The doctor will arrive in due course. Until then, Lucas will wait quietly. An hour? Eliza stared at her. He could go into shock. He needs his arm immobilized. He needs warmth and fluids. And you learned this where exactly? From your scandalous father's vast medical knowledge? The servants were watching now, a ring of faces ranging from curious to hostile. Eliza felt the weight of their judgment like physical pressure. None of them trusted her. None of them would follow her orders if Constance countermanded them. But Lucas was turning gray, and an hour was too long. I learned it from my mother, Eliza said quietly, meeting Constance's glare without flinching. She volunteered at a charity hospital in London before she married. She taught me basic wound care and how to stabilize injuries. I'm not a doctor, but I know enough to keep him alive until one arrives. Your mother was a fool who married beneath her station and died for it. I'll not have her daughter experimenting on my nephew. Something in Eliza snapped. She'd been polite. She'd been deferential. She'd swallowed every insult and ignored every slight because she was trying to survive in a house that didn't want her. But watching Lucas suffer while this bitter woman played power games was too much. Your nephew? Eliza's voice cut like ice. Last I checked, Lucas was Adrian's brother. And Adrian is my husband, which makes Lucas my family, not yours. So you can either help me or get out of my way, but you will not stand there and let him suffer to prove a point." Constance's face went purple. "You dare!" "I dare." Eliza turned to the nearest maid. "Hot water and linens. Now, or I'll report to the Duke that his brother deteriorated while you all stood around debating protocols." The maid glanced at Constance, then at Lucas, who was now shaking violently. She fled. Eliza knelt beside Lucas, ignoring Constance's outraged sputtering. She'd helped her mother enough times to know the basics. The arm needed to be straightened and immobilized before the swelling got worse. It would hurt. Lucas would probably scream. But leaving it crooked would do permanent damage. "This is going to be awful," she told him honestly. "I'm sorry." "Just do it," Lucas gritted out. "Can't be worse than it already is." It was worse. Lucas did scream when Eliza straightened the arm, a sound that brought more servants running. But she worked quickly, using strips of linen to create a makeshift splint with pieces of wood from the fireplace kindling. Her hands shook, but she kept them steady through sheer force of will. By the time the doctor arrived, Adrian thundering in behind him, covered in snow. Lucas's arm was immobilized. He was wrapped in blankets, and he'd stopped shaking. The doctor examined Eliza's work with the expression of a man expecting to find catastrophe, and instead finding competence. "Well," he said finally, "someone knew what they were doing. Clean break, properly aligned. The splint is textbook. Who's responsible?" "Lady Blackthorne," Harrison said quietly. The butler had appeared at some point during the crisis, watching everything with his usual neutral expression. Adrian's gaze snapped to Eliza, who was sitting on the floor beside Lucas's bed, her dressing gown stained with blood from where Lucas's fall had scraped his skin. She felt exposed, vulnerable, suddenly aware that she'd just acted on pure instinct without considering the consequences. "You did this?" Adrian asked. "She saved my arm," Lucas said before Eliza could answer. His voice was weak but clear. Constance wanted to wait. Eliza knew better. Adrian looked at his aunt, who stood in the corner wearing an expression of pure fury. "Is this true?" "The girl overstepped," Constance snapped. "She had no authority to—" "She had every authority. She's my wife." Adrian's voice was flat, but there was steel underneath it. "Lucas's family. She acted to protect him. If you prevented that, Aunt, then you and I need to have a very different conversation." Constance's mouth opened and closed. Then she drew herself up with wounded dignity. "I see how things stand now. Your judgment has been compromised by a pretty face in desperate circumstances. When this ends badly, and it will, don't say I didn't warn you." She swept from the room, her skirts crackling with indignation. The doctor finished his examination, pronounced Eliza's work satisfactory, and left instructions for laudanum and rest. Adrian thanked him, saw him out, then returned to find Eliza still sitting on the floor, exhausted and shaking now that the crisis had passed. "You should rest," he said quietly. "I'm fine." "You're in shock, and you're bleeding." He gestured to her hands, which she now saw were scraped raw from handling the rough wood splints. "It's nothing." Adrian knelt beside her, taking her hands in his, and examining the damage with careful attention. His touch was clinical, impersonal, but it was the first time he'd touched her since their wedding kiss, and Eliza felt it like electricity. "You were right," he said finally, "about trying, about existing in the same house instead of haunting it separately." He looked up, meeting her eyes. "You saved my brother's life today, or at least his ability to use that arm. Constance would have let him wait, and the damage would have been permanent. I only did what needed to be done. Most people wouldn't have. Most people would have deferred to authority, followed protocol, avoided making waves." His grip on her hands tightened slightly. "You're stronger than I gave you credit for." "I'm just tired of being afraid," Eliza said honestly. "Of being invisible. Of letting other people decide whether I matter." Something shifted in Adrian's expression. Recognition, maybe, or respect. "You matter," he said quietly. "You're my wife. That makes you Duchess of Blackthorne, and anyone who treats you as less than that will answer to me, including Constance." It should have felt like a victory. But the way he said it, cold, factual, a statement of territorial rights rather than affection, reminded Eliza that she was still just a piece on his chessboard. Protected, yes, valued for her utility, but not wanted. "Thank you," she said, pulling her hands free. "I should clean up." She stood and walked to the door, forcing herself not to run. Behind her, she heard Lucas say something to Adrian in a voice too low to catch. Adrian's response was equally quiet. They were talking about her, probably. Analyzing her actions, deciding what they meant. She didn't want to know. Over the next week, things shifted in ways both subtle and profound. The servants who'd been coolly distant began to thaw slightly. Not friendly exactly, but less openly hostile. Harrison actually smiled at her once when she asked about the household accounts. Even the cook sent up extra portions at dinner, which Eliza chose to interpret as approval. But Constance's hatred intensified. She made her displeasure known in 1,000 small ways, countermanding Eliza's request to servants, monopolizing Adrian's time when he was home, making pointed comments about breeding and propriety at every opportunity. She held the household purse strings and used them like weapons, denying expenditures Eliza requested while lavishing money on things Constance preferred. "She's trying to starve you out," Lucas observed one afternoon. His arm was healing well, and he'd taken to joining Eliza for tea in the library. "Make your life so miserable you'll leave." "I'm not leaving." "Good. Because watching you stand up to her is the most entertainment I've had in years." He grinned, then sobered. "But seriously, Eliza, be careful. Constance has been running this estate for 6 years. She has allies among the staff, connections in the county, and enough stored-up bitterness to poison a well. She won't forgive you for humiliating her in front of the servants." "What would you have me do? Bow and scrape and let her control everything?" "No, but watch your back, and maybe—" He hesitated. "Maybe talk to Adrian. He's been different since the accident. Present, almost. Like he's waking up from a 6-year sleep. If you can get through to him, really through to him, Constance loses her power." Eliza thought about the careful dinners she and Adrian shared now, the stilted conversations, the way he sometimes looked at her like he was trying to solve an equation. Progress, yes, but barely. "I'm trying," she said. "Try harder. Because I have a bad feeling about what Constance might do if she feels cornered." Lucas's words proved prophetic 2 days later. Eliza woke to cold, real cold, the kind that bit through blankets and turned breath to ice. She stumbled out of bed and found her rooms freezing, the fire completely out. When she tried to call for a servant, no one came. She dressed quickly, her fingers clumsy with cold, and ventured into the hallway. The entire wing was frigid and empty. Not a servant in sight. Something was wrong. She made her way to the main house and found it in chaos. Servants were running everywhere, some carrying buckets, others hauling furniture. The smell of smoke hung in the air. "What's happened?" She grabbed the nearest maid. "Fire, Your Grace. Started in the kitchen. It's under control now, but the whole east side of the servants' quarters is damaged. Mrs. Blackthorne is organizing temporary accommodations." "Where's the Duke?" "Rode to the village at dawn. There's illness spreading, 3 families down with fever. He's arranging for doctors and supplies." Of course, Adrian would be gone when disaster struck. Eliza found Constance in the servants' hall, surrounded by a cluster of exhausted, soot-stained staff. She was directing operations with military precision: who would sleep where, what could be salvaged, how the kitchen would function until repairs could be made. "How did it start?" Eliza asked. Constance didn't even look at her. Carelessness. A dropped candle, perhaps. These things happen. In the middle of winter? When everyone knows to be careful with fire? "Are you suggesting something, Lady Blackthorne?" Now Constance did look at her, and her eyes were cold as death. "Because if you're implying that this was anything other than an accident, you should have proof before making accusations." Eliza didn't have proof, but she had instinct, and every instinct screamed that this was too convenient. A fire that drove the servants from their quarters, creating chaos and disorder, all while Adrian was conveniently absent. "I'm not accusing anyone," she said carefully. "I'm offering to help. What needs to be done?" Constance's expression suggested she'd rather eat glass than accept Eliza's assistance. "Everything is handled. Return to your rooms. The servants need somewhere to sleep. There must be unused rooms in the main house." "Absolutely not." Constance's voice cracked like a whip. The main house is for family and guests. Servants will be housed in the stables until the quarters are repaired. The stables? Eliza stared at her. In this cold? They'll freeze. They'll survive. They're hardy stock. Around them, the servants stood silent, faces carefully blank. But Eliza could see the fear in their eyes, the resignation. They expected to be sent to the stables. They expected to suffer. Because that's how things worked at Blackthorn Hall. Constance gave orders, and everyone obeyed. No, Eliza said. The word fell into silence like a stone into still water. I beg your pardon? Constance's voice was dangerously soft. I said no. The servants will not sleep in the stables. There are at least a dozen unused rooms in the south wing. They'll stay there until their quarters are habitable. You have no authority to, I'm the Duchess of Blackthorn. This is my house. I have every authority. Eliza turned to Harrison, who'd appeared in the doorway. Please prepare the south wing rooms for temporary occupancy. Clean linens, fires in every grate, and extra blankets from the storage. Harrison's face was carefully neutral, but his eyes flickered to Constance, then back to Eliza, waiting to see who would win. If you defy me in this, Constance said quietly, there will be consequences. I've managed this estate for 6 years. The staff is loyal to me. Adrian trusts me. You're a girl who's been here less than a month. Who do you think they'll obey? It was the moment of truth. Eliza could back down, retreat to her rooms, let Constance win. It would be safer. Smarter, maybe. But she thought of the servants shivering in the stables while unused rooms sat empty. She thought of Constance's cruelty disguised as efficiency. She thought of Adrian's promise that she mattered, that she was Duchess, that people who treated her as less would answer to him. Harrison, she said clearly, the Duke left me in charge during his absence. I'm giving you a direct order. Prepare the south wing rooms, now. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Harrison bowed. Yes, Your Grace. The servants erupted into motion, some heading toward the south wing, others gathering linens and supplies. Constance stood frozen, her face white with rage, as her authority crumbled around her. You've made a terrible mistake, she whispered. Perhaps, Eliza said, but at least I can sleep at night knowing I made it. She turned and walked away, her legs shaking so badly she thought she might fall. Behind her, she heard Constance's voice, low and venomous, giving orders to someone. But Eliza didn't look back. She'd won. For now. Adrian returned at dusk to find his house transformed. Servants sleeping in the south wing, the kitchen operating out of the scullery, and his wife and his aunt engaged in what Harrison delicately described as a difference of opinion regarding household management. He found Eliza in the library, staring into the fire with unseeing eyes. She looked exhausted, shadows under her eyes, her hair coming loose from its pins. Harrison told me what you did, he said from the doorway. Eliza didn't turn. Are you here to tell me I overstepped? I'm here to ask why you did it. Because it was right. Because sending people to freeze in stables when there are warm rooms available is cruel. Because I'm tired of watching Constance run this house like her personal kingdom while you hide in your study or your fields or anywhere that lets you avoid dealing with her. The words came out harsher than she'd intended, but she was too tired to soften them. She turned to face him, and something of what she was feeling must have shown in her face because Adrian actually flinched. You're right, he said quietly. I've been avoiding the problem. It was easier to let Constance manage things than to engage. But that ends now. Why? Because I forced your hand? Because the servants might be more loyal to me than to her, and that threatens the power structure you've maintained through apathy? Because you're my wife, and I made you a promise to try. Adrian crossed the room and stood in front of her, close enough that she could see the weariness in his eyes. I'm not good at this, Eliza. I don't know how to be a husband. I don't know how to run a household. I've spent 6 years in survival mode, and you're asking me to live instead of just exist. I'm not asking for miracles. I'm asking you to stand with me instead of leaving me to fight alone. Then I will. He reached out and took her hand, her damaged, scraped hand that still bore marks from splinting Lucas's arm. Constance will be told that you have full authority over household matters. If she can't accept that, she'll be asked to leave. She'll fight you. Let her. Something hard entered his expression. I've spent 6 years being dead inside, Eliza. I'm tired of it. You came into this house and refused to be invisible. You saved my brother. You fought for servants who have no one else to fight for them. He paused, seeming to search for words. You're alive in a way I'd forgotten was possible. And I'm tired of being the ghost. Eliza's throat tightened. It wasn't a declaration of love. It wasn't even affection, really. But it was real, honest, more than she dared hope for. Then be alive, she whispered. With me. For a moment she thought he might kiss her, really kiss her, not the cold brush of lips they'd exchanged at the altar. But he just squeezed her hand gently and stepped back. I should speak with Constance. This won't be pleasant. Do you want me there? No. This is between her and me. It should have been handled years ago. He walked to the door, then paused. Thank you, Eliza, for refusing to let me hide. Then he was gone, and Eliza was left alone with the fire and the faint, fragile hope that maybe they could build something real from the ashes of their contract marriage. She heard the shouting an hour later, Constance's voice rising to a shriek, Adrian's remaining cold and level. The argument raged through the house like a storm, and servants scattered before it, none wanting to be caught in the crossfire. Then silence, heavy and ominous. Eliza was heading to bed when Lucas found her in the hallway, his face pale. You need to come, he said urgently. Now! What's happened? Constance, she's just come. Please. He led her to the north wing, the locked, forbidden north wing where Isabel's ghost still lived in dust-covered rooms. The door stood open, and inside, Eliza could hear Adrian's voice, raw with something that might have been grief or rage, or both. She stepped through the doorway and stopped. The nursery had been destroyed. Isabel's portrait lay shattered on the floor, the painted face slashed beyond recognition. Furniture was overturned, toys crushed, curtains ripped from the windows. Someone had taken everything sacred in this room and desecrated it with methodical, deliberate cruelty. Adrian knelt in the center of the destruction, holding a piece of the destroyed portrait, his shoulders shaking, and Constance stood in the doorway opposite, her face a mask of righteous fury. This is what comes of bringing disgrace into this house, she hissed. You dishonor your sister's memory with this mockery of a marriage. You replace the girl who made this place worth living with a fortune-hunting whore who's already turning you against your own blood. Well, I won't stand for it. If you won't preserve Isabel's legacy, then neither shall anyone else. The words hung in the air like poison. Adrian stood slowly, still holding the ruined portrait. When he turned to face his aunt, his expression was absolutely empty. Not angry, not grieving, just gone. Get out, he said softly. I will not. Get out! The roar filled the house, echoing off stone walls, making windows rattle. Get out of this house, out of this county, out of my sight before I have you thrown out bodily. You have 1 hour to pack. After that, anything you leave behind will be burned. You can't mean... I've never meant anything more in my life. You destroyed the last piece of my sister I had left because you couldn't bear to lose control. You're poison, Aunt. Isabel would be ashamed of what you've become. Constance's face crumpled. I loved her too. Everything I've done to honor her memory. You've done nothing but use her death as an excuse to spread misery. Adrian's voice was ice. She was light and joy and love. You've turned this house into a tomb and called it tribute. Well, no more. Get out. Constance looked at Eliza, her eyes burning with hatred. This is your doing. You've poisoned him against his own family. No, Eliza said quietly. You did that yourself. For a moment, Constance looked like she might attack, actually physically attack. Then she drew herself up, gathered what remained of her dignity, and swept from the room. Her footsteps echoed away down the corridor. A door slammed in the distance. The house seemed to exhale, releasing tension it had held for years. Adrian stood amid the wreckage of his sister's sanctuary, still holding the broken portrait, his face carved from stone. Adrian, Eliza said softly. He didn't respond, didn't even seem to hear her. Lucas touched her shoulder gently. Give him time. This is all he had left of her, and now it's gone. But Eliza couldn't just leave him there, drowning in grief and destruction. She walked forward until she stood directly in front of him, close enough to touch. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm so sorry." "It's not your fault." His voice was hollow. "Constance is right about one thing. I should never have locked these rooms. I should have let them go years ago. Holding on to ghosts doesn't bring them back. It just keeps you dead alongside them." "She's not gone, Adrian. Not really." Eliza gestured to the destruction around them. "This was just a room. The portrait was just paint. Your sister lived in here." She touched his chest lightly over his heart. "And there's nothing Constance can destroy that will take that away." He looked down at her hand, then at her face, and something in his expression shifted. The emptiness receded, replaced by something raw and real and utterly human. "How are you so strong?" he whispered. "I'm not strong. I'm just stubborn. There's a difference." And then he was kissing her. Not the cold brush of duty, but real and desperate and alive. His hands came up to frame her face, the broken portrait falling forgotten to the floor as he pulled her closer. Eliza gasped against his mouth and kissed him back, pouring into it all the loneliness and fear and desperate hope she'd carried since signing that contract in his carriage. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Adrian rested his forehead against hers. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. "How to be alive again. How to be a husband instead of just a title." "Then we'll learn together," Eliza said. "Because I don't know how to be a duchess, but I know how to survive. And maybe survival is enough to start with." He kissed her again, softer this time, and Eliza felt the last of the walls between them begin to crack. Behind them, Lucas cleared his throat delicately. "As touching as this is, we should probably deal with the fact that Constance just left threatening vengeance and destruction. She's not the type to go quietly." Adrian pulled back reluctantly, but he kept one arm around Eliza's waist, the first casual touch of affection he'd offered. "Let her go. She has no power here anymore." "You sure about that?" Lucas gestured to the ruined nursery. "Because this says otherwise, and people who are cornered and desperate do unpredictable things." A scream cut through the house, high and terrified, and all too human. They ran. The smell of smoke hit them before they reached the stairs. Real smoke this time, thick and black, billowing from the direction of the south wing, where the servants were sleeping, where Eliza had moved them to safety. "No," Eliza breathed. They reached the landing to find chaos. Servants in night clothes, running, coughing, choking on smoke. Flames licked from under the door to the largest guest room, the one where most of the displaced staff had been housed. And standing at the end of the corridor, silhouetted against a window, was Constance. She held a lamp in one hand and wore an expression of such cold satisfaction that Eliza's blood turned to ice. "If I can't have this house," Constance said clearly, "then no one will." She dropped the lamp. It shattered on the wooden floor, and fire bloomed like a horrible flower, racing along oil she must have spread earlier, turning the corridor into an inferno. Adrian shoved Eliza toward Lucas. "Get everyone out, now! North entrance, through the gardens." "What are you—" "Now!" Lucas grabbed Eliza and pulled her toward the stairs as Adrian ran toward the flames, toward Constance, toward what had to be suicide because no one could survive that heat, that smoke, that rage of fire consuming everything. "No!" Eliza screamed, fighting Lucas's grip. "Adrian!" But Lucas was stronger, and he dragged her down the stairs through the entrance hall now filling with smoke, out into the frigid night where servants huddled in terrified clusters. The house blazed behind them, flames shooting from windows, smoke blotting out the stars. And somewhere inside, Adrian was still fighting to save a house, a legacy, a life that might already be lost. Eliza stood in the snow and watched Blackthorn Hall burn, and prayed to anyone listening that the man she'd just started to love wouldn't die, proving he knew how to be alive. The minutes stretched like hours. Eliza stood frozen in the snow, her nightdress soaked through, her bare feet numb, watching flames devour the south wing while smoke poured from every window. Servants wept around her, clutching whatever they'd managed to grab before fleeing, a photograph, a letter, a single shoe. The heat from the blaze was so intense she could feel it even 50 yards away, turning snowflakes to steam before they could touch the ground. Lucas gripped her arm, his face set in grim determination. He'll come out. Adrian survived worse than this. What could possibly be worse than running into an inferno after a madwoman? You'd be surprised. But Lucas's voice shook, betraying his fear. A crash thundered through the night as part of the roof collapsed, sending sparks spiraling into the black sky like dying stars. Eliza made a sound that might have been a sob or a prayer. She couldn't tell anymore. Then a figure emerged from the smoke. Adrian carrying Constance's unconscious body, his clothes singed and his face blackened with soot. He staggered down the front steps and collapsed to his knees in the snow, coughing so violently his whole body convulsed. Eliza ran. Her feet found purchase on ice and stone without her conscious direction, and then she was there, dropping beside him, her hands on his face, his shoulders checking for burns, for broken bones, for anything that would tell her how badly he was hurt. "I'm fine," he rasped, though he clearly wasn't. "The servants... Did everyone get out?" "Harrison's doing a count," Lucas said, appearing at their side. "What about her?" He gestured to Constance, who lay motionless in the snow. "She was trapped. The fire spread faster than she expected. She would have died if I'd left her." Adrian looked at his aunt with something that might have been pity. "She's breathing, but barely. Someone get the doctor." "Already sent for," Harrison confirmed, materializing from the chaos with his usual efficiency. "Your Grace, I've accounted for all staff. Minor injuries, smoke inhalation, but everyone survived. The south wing is lost, but the fire hasn't spread to the main house yet." "Yet?" Eliza repeated. She turned to look at Blackthorn Hall, the massive Gothic structure that had seemed so indestructible. The south wing was fully engulfed, flames eating through centuries-old timber and stone. If the fire reached the main structure, everything would be lost. Adrian struggled to his feet, swaying. "We need to create a fire break. Pull down the connecting corridor before the flames jump." "You can't be serious." Lucas stared at him. "You just nearly died in there. You're in no condition. It's my house." Adrian's voice was steel-wrapped in ash. "Harrison, get me axes and every able-bodied man. We tear down the corridor manually. It's the only way." What followed was the longest night of Eliza's life. While Adrian and 20 men attacked the burning corridor with axes and brute strength, she organized the women and children into bucket brigades, dousing everything near the fire line with water hauled from the frozen pond. Her hands blistered and bled. Her lungs burned from smoke. Her feet went from numb to agonizing as feeling returned, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop, because Adrian was in there, risking everything to save a house that had been his prison for 6 years. And if he could fight for it, so could she. The doctor arrived and worked on Constance in the snow, covering her with blankets and forcing medicine between her lips. She woke briefly, saw the destruction she'd caused, and began weeping. Horrible, broken sobs that spoke of a mind shattered beyond repair. "She'll need to be institutionalized," the doctor said quietly to Lucas. "The fever, the delusions. This isn't simple malice. Her mind is gone." Lucas's expression was complicated. Anger, pity, and something like grief all warring for dominance. She loved Isabel so much it poisoned her. After she died, Constance had nothing else to live for except control. And when that was threatened, he didn't finish. He didn't need to. Dawn came gray and ash-covered. The fire was out. The south wing was a smoking ruin, the connecting corridor destroyed, but the main house stood, scarred, damaged, but standing. Adrian sat on the front steps, his head in his hands, surrounded by exhausted men who looked like they'd fought a war, which, in a way, they had. Eliza walked to him slowly, her legs barely supporting her weight. She sat beside him without speaking, and for a long moment they simply existed together in the wreckage of the night. "I thought I'd lost you," she said finally, "when you ran into the fire. I thought I'd lose everything if I didn't." He looked at the ruined wing. "Strange, isn't it? A month ago, I wouldn't have cared. I'd have let it burn and called it justice. But now you have something to fight for." "Yes." He turned to look at her, and despite the soot and exhaustion, his eyes were clear. "I have you." It wasn't a grand declaration, but coming from Adrian, from the man who'd promised her nothing but cold efficiency, it meant everything. "We should get everyone inside," she said, standing on trembling legs. "The main house is crowded, but it's warm, and we need to tend to injuries properly." "No." Eliza blinked. "What?" Adrian stood as well, addressing the gathered crowd of servants, tenants who'd arrived to help, and neighbors who'd seen the flames from miles away. His voice carried across the courtyard, strong despite the smoke damage. "Blackthorn Hall has been a tomb for 6 years. My tomb. I let it become cold and cruel because I was cold and cruel. But last night, my wife, your Duchess, fought beside you. She organized you. She saved you when my own aunt tried to murder you out of spite." He paused, making sure everyone could see his face, hear his words. "She's shown me what this house could be, what it should be. A home, not a prison. A place of warmth, not ice." The crowd stirred, uncertain where this was going. "From this moment forward, things change," Adrian continued. "The South Wing will be rebuilt, but not as it was. It will be better, warmer, safer, designed for the people who keep this estate running. Every servant who stayed last night, who fought the fire, who refused to abandon this place, will receive a month's extra wages. And Lady Blackthorn will have full authority over all household matters, not because I command it, but because she's earned it." Silence. Then someone started clapping. One person, then another, then a wave of applause that washed over the courtyard like a breaking dam. The servants who'd been cold to Eliza, suspicious of her, were now looking at her with something like respect, even gratitude. Harrison stepped forward and bowed deeply. "Your Grace, we are honored to serve you." It was the first time he'd said it and meant it. Eliza's throat tightened. She wanted to cry, to collapse, to sleep for a week. Instead, she nodded and managed to speak clearly. "Thank you all. Now let's get inside before we freeze to death." The crowd dispersed slowly, people helping each other toward the warmth of the main house. Lucas appeared at Eliza's side, supporting her as her legs finally gave out. "Well played," he murmured. "You've won them over completely. Even the ones who thought you were a gold-digging scandal merchant now see you as the woman who saved their lives. I didn't do it to win anyone over. I did it because it needed doing." Which is exactly why it worked. Lucas helped her up the steps. "Adrian was right, you know. You've changed this place. Changed him. I haven't seen my brother this alive since before Isabel died." "He saved Constance," Eliza said quietly. "Even after what she did. He could have let her burn, and no one would have blamed him. That's the man he used to be, before grief turned him into stone." Lucas smiled, though exhaustion made it fragile. "Welcome to the family, Duchess. Properly, this time." The next days were chaos of a different kind. Constance was taken to a private sanatorium in Scotland, still weeping and incoherent, muttering about Isabel and fire and the end of everything. Adrian signed the commitment papers with a steady hand, but Eliza saw the grief in his eyes. Constance had been poison, yes, but she'd also been family. Losing her, even this way, reopened wounds he'd thought were scarred over. The house filled with workers, carpenters, masons, architects. Adrian threw himself into the reconstruction with the same intensity he'd once reserved for avoiding emotion. But now Eliza was beside him, reviewing plans, making decisions, turning the ruins of the South Wing into something better than it had been. "Larger windows," she insisted, pointing to the architect's drawings. "More fireplaces, proper insulation. These people deserve to be warm." The architect looked to Adrian, who nodded. "Whatever my wife wants, cost is no object." Word spread quickly through the county. The Duke of Blackthorn, the ice-cold tyrant who'd terrorized business rivals and crushed competitors without mercy, was rebuilding his servants' quarters to standards that rivaled manor houses. And his mysterious new wife, the scandal-tainted girl he'd married out of nowhere, was the force behind it. Neighbors began calling, ostensibly to offer sympathy and assistance, but really to satisfy their curiosity. Eliza received them in the drawing room, serving tea and deflecting questions with polite efficiency. She was still learning the role of Duchess, but the instincts she'd honed surviving London society served her well here. Lady Pemberton, wife of the local magistrate, was particularly persistent. "My dear Duchess, you must tell us, how did you come to marry the Duke?" The circumstances were so sudden. We met. We found we suited each other. We married. Eliza smiled blandly. There's really not much more to tell. But your family's circumstances, forgive my bluntness, but the gossip from London suggests. Gossip from London, Eliza interrupted gently, has no bearing on my life here. I'm Lady Blackthorne now. My past is exactly that. Past. She said it with such finality that even Lady Pemberton backed down. But Eliza could see the speculation in the woman's eyes. These people would accept her because Adrian had claimed her because she'd proven herself during the fire. But they'd never forget where she came from. She'd always be the scandal-tainted duchess who'd married up out of desperation. Fine. Let them think what they wanted. She'd survived worse than society gossip. 2 weeks after the fire, Adrian found her in what would become the new library, a room they were building in the reconstructed south wing, designed with floor-to-ceiling windows to let in maximum light. She was reviewing furniture catalogs, making notes about which pieces would work best. You're transforming this place, he said, leaning against the doorframe. We're transforming it, she corrected. I just make suggestions. You approve them. I've approved every single one without question. That's not collaboration. That's abdication. He crossed to where she sat and took the catalog from her hands. Eliza, I need to tell you something. The seriousness in his tone made her nervous. What is it? I've been trying to figure out when it happened. When you stopped being a contract and started being, he searched for words, essential. I thought it might have been the fire, or when you saved Lucas, or when you stood up to Constance. But it wasn't any single moment. It was all of them. It was watching you refuse to be invisible, refuse to let this house stay dead. Adrian, let me finish. He took her hands in his. I married you for practical reasons. I needed a wife. You needed security. That was the agreement. But somewhere in the last month, the agreement stopped being enough. You stopped being enough. I want more. Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs. What are you saying? I'm saying I'm falling in love with my wife, and I have no idea how to handle it. He laughed, the sound rough and uncertain. I've spent 6 years being dead inside. You make me want to be alive. You make me want things I thought I'd never want again. A real marriage, children. A future that's more than just managing estates and avoiding emotion. You make me want to try. You've been trying, Eliza said softly. You ran into a burning building to save someone who tried to kill us. You're rebuilding this house into a home. You're here, talking to me about feelings you've buried for years. If that's not trying, I don't know what is. It's terrifying. I know. She squeezed his hands. It terrifies me too. Because I'm falling in love with you as well, and I don't know how to reconcile that with the fact that I married you for survival. It feels like I'm betraying the person I was a month ago, the desperate girl who signed that contract because she had no other choice. You're not betraying her. You're honoring her by building something better than survival. Adrian pulled her to her feet, his arms coming around her waist. We started with a contract, but we don't have to stay there. We can choose something else, something real. And if we fail, if the love we're building falls apart, then we'll have tried, and that's more than I've done in 6 years. He kissed her forehead, gentle and reverent. I can't promise perfection, Eliza. I can't promise I won't shut down sometimes, or fall back into old habits, but I can promise I'll keep trying, if you'll try with me. She looked up at him, this man who'd started as a stranger, a cold duke buying a desperate bride, and had slowly transformed into someone she couldn't imagine living without. The journey from contract to connection had been brutal, marked by fire and fear and confrontation. But they'd survived it, together. I'll try, she whispered. I'll keep trying until trying becomes breathing. He kissed her then, and it was nothing like their wedding kiss or even the desperate kiss in Isabel's ruined nursery. This was slow and deep and full of promise. The kiss of two people choosing each other, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. When they finally broke apart, both smiling, the architect appeared in the doorway and coughed delicately. Your Graces, forgive the interruption, but I need approval on the South Wing's heating system. There's a new design using radiant warmth through the floors, expensive but remarkably efficient. Should I proceed with the estimates? Adrian looked at Eliza, who nodded. Proceed, he said. If it keeps people warm, cost doesn't matter. The architect bowed and withdrew. Adrian turned back to Eliza, shaking his head in wonder. A month ago, I'd have called that expense frivolous. Now I'm approving it without a second thought. What have you done to me? Made you human, Eliza said simply, or reminded you that you already were. The reconstruction continued through February and into March. As winter reluctantly released its grip on the estate, the south wing rose from its ashes. New timber, new stone, new purpose. But the changes went deeper than architecture. Adrian began spending mornings with Eliza, reviewing estate business over breakfast instead of disappearing into his study. He started attending tenant meetings again, listening to concerns he'd ignored for years, implementing changes that Eliza suggested: fair rent adjustments, profit sharing for good harvests, education funds for workers' children. You'll bankrupt me, he said one evening, reviewing the accounts. No, I'll make you beloved, Eliza countered. Money can always be earned back. Loyalty can't be bought. He was learning to trust her judgment. More than that, he was learning to value her partnership. They made decisions together now, debated options, challenged each other's assumptions. The cold distance between them thawed into something warm and vital, and the household noticed. Servants who'd once moved through the halls like ghosts now smiled and chatted. The kitchen produced meals with actual flavor instead of institutional blandness. Harrison began displaying an almost paternal protectiveness toward Eliza, ensuring her comfort and defending her decisions to anyone who questioned them. Even the tenants noticed. When Adrian and Eliza rode through the estate together, people came out to wave, to offer thanks, to share news. Children who'd once hidden when the Duke passed now ran to greet them, and Adrian, stern, cold Adrian, actually smiled at them. Lucas watched it all with satisfaction. I told you, he said to Eliza one afternoon in the library. You've performed a miracle. My brother is almost pleasant now. It's deeply unsettling. He was always capable of it. He just needed a reason to try. And you gave him one. Lucas's expression turned serious. I'm grateful, for what you've done. Not just for Adrian, but for this whole place. Blackthorn Hall was dying. You've given it life. We all did. You, me, Adrian, the servants who stayed and fought. It wasn't one person. Maybe, but you were the catalyst. You refused to accept that cold and cruel were inevitable. He paused. Isabel would have liked you, I think. She always believed people could change if given the right reasons. You've proven her right. The mention of Isabel no longer carried the same weight of grief. Adrian had opened the north wing again, clearing out the destroyed nursery and transforming it into something new, a music room filled with instruments and light. He'd given away Isabel's toys to tenant children, keeping only the undamaged portrait, which now hung in the main drawing room where everyone could see it. She should be remembered with joy, not locked away in darkness, he told Eliza. That's not what she would have wanted. It was a measure of how far he'd come that he could say it without his voice breaking. On the first day of April, exactly 2 months after the fire, the south wing reopened. The servants moved into rooms that were warm, bright, and comfortable, better than anything they'd had before. Adrian gave a short speech about new beginnings and second chances, and Eliza stood beside him, her hand in his, watching people who'd once feared him now look at him with genuine respect. That night they hosted a celebration dinner, not just for family and neighbors, but for the entire household staff. It was unprecedented. Dukes didn't dine with servants. But Adrian had stopped caring about what dukes were supposed to do. To Lady Blackthorn, Harrison said, raising his glass, who reminded us all that a house is only as strong as the people who make it a home. To the Duchess! The room echoed, and Eliza felt tears prick her eyes. She'd come to Blackthorn Hall as a desperate girl with nothing, expecting nothing. She'd fought for every scrap of respect, every moment of warmth, every acknowledgement that she existed. And now she stood in a room full of people who saw her not as the scandal-tainted nobody, but as the woman who'd saved them, led them, transformed their world. Later, when the guests had departed and the house settled into peaceful quiet, Adrian led her to their rooms, not separate quarters anymore, but shared chambers they'd moved into together the week before. Happy? he asked, pulling her into his arms. Happier than I thought possible 2 months ago. When you climbed into my carriage with nothing but a small trunk and more courage than sense? I had no courage then, only desperation. You had more courage than you knew. He kissed her temple. You faced down a hostile household, a bitter aunt, and a fire, all while building something beautiful from ruins. That's not desperation. That's strength. Eliza leaned into him, savoring the warmth of his embrace, the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. This man who'd started as a cold contract was now her partner, her anchor, her home. I love you, she said quietly. I know I've said it before, but I need you to hear it again. I love you, Adrian. Not because you saved me, but because you let me save you too. His arms tightened around her. I love you too, more than I knew I could love anything. You've given me back my life, Eliza. Let me spend the rest of it proving I'm worthy of the gift. Outside, spring rain fell soft and steady, washing away the last traces of winter ash. Blackthorn Hall stood against the night, its windows blazing with warm light, no longer a tomb, but a beacon. And inside, two people who'd found each other in desperation were learning to build something better. A marriage not of convenience, but of choice, of love, hard-won and carefully tended, of second chances grabbed with both hands and held tight against all odds. The contract that had bound them was still legally valid, but it no longer mattered. They'd moved beyond agreements and obligations into something far more powerful, a partnership forged in fire and tempered by trust. Eliza had come to Blackthorn Hall expecting survival. Instead, she'd found life itself. But survival, as Eliza was learning, was only the foundation. Building a life required something more. The letter arrived in late April, carried by a rider who'd pushed his horse hard from London. Harrison brought it to the breakfast room where Eliza and Adrian sat reviewing the week's accounts, their heads bent together over ledgers that showed, for the first time in years, genuine profit alongside genuine contentment. From London, Your Grace, Harrison said, presenting the letter on a silver tray. Marked urgent. Adrian broke the seal and read in silence, his expression darkening with each line. Finally, he set the letter down and looked at Eliza with something like regret. It's from the Royal Agricultural Society. They've heard about our tenant reforms, the profit sharing, the education funds, the housing improvements. They want me to present our methods at their summer conference. He paused. In London. The word hung between them like a blade. London, where Eliza's scandal still echoed through drawing rooms, where her father's disgrace was still fresh gossip, where everyone who'd abandoned her would see her return as the Duchess of Blackthorn and draw their own conclusions about how far a desperate woman would sink. You should go, Eliza said quietly. Your work here deserves recognition. Our work. And I won't go without you. Adrian's jaw set in the stubborn line she'd come to know well. If they want to hear about Blackthorn's transformation, they'll hear about the woman who made it possible. If London society can't handle that, they can go to hell. Adrian, no. He took her hand across the table. I've spent 6 years hiding from the world, Eliza. I'm done hiding, and I won't let you hide either. You're my wife, my partner. If they want me, they get us both. Lucas, who'd been pretending not to listen while demolishing a plate of eggs, looked up with a grin. Oh, this is going to be spectacular. The Ice Duke returns from exile with his scandalous bride. London won't know what hit them. London can think what it wants, Adrian said flatly. We're going to present the facts about estate management reform. If anyone wants to gossip about personal matters, they'll find themselves excluded from the conversation. But Eliza knew it wouldn't be that simple. Nothing ever was. They departed for London in mid-May, traveling in the Blackthorn carriage with Lucas for company and moral support. The journey took 2 days, and with each mile closer to the city, Eliza felt the old anxiety returning. The fear of judgment, of whispered conversations stopping when she entered a room, of eyes that saw only scandal and not the person underneath. You're doing that thing again, Adrian observed as they crossed into the London suburbs. What thing? Disappearing inside yourself. Building walls. He pulled her closer on the seat. Don't. I need you fierce and present, not hiding. I'm not hiding. I'm preparing. For battle? Lucas asked cheerfully. Because that's what this feels like. The Duke and Duchess of Blackthorn, storming London to force society to acknowledge what they'd rather ignore, that people can change, that scandal doesn't define you, and that love can grow in the coldest soil. You're being poetic again, Adrian said dryly. It's deeply unsettling. I'm being honest. You two are a love story, whether you admit it or not. The ruthless Duke and the desperate bride who refuse to let each other stay broken. People will either be inspired or horrified. Lucas grinned, possibly both. They stayed at the Blackthorn London residence, the same townhouse where Eliza had spent her wedding night, feeling like an intruder in someone else's life. Now walking through its halls as its mistress, she felt the strangeness of how much had changed. She was no longer the frightened girl in a borrowed nightgown. She was the Duchess of Blackthorn, partner to a man she loved, architect of a transformation that had saved an entire estate. But London didn't know that yet. London only knew the old story, the scandal, the debts, the desperate marriage. The conference was scheduled for the end of the week. In the days leading up to it, invitations arrived. Dinner parties, afternoon teas, balls hosted by people who wanted to assess the mysterious Duchess and confirm or deny the rumors swirling about her. We declined them all, Adrian said, tossing the invitations into the fire. We can't, Eliza countered. If we hide, we confirm every awful thing they're thinking. We have to show them we're not ashamed. I'm not ashamed. I'm uninterested in their judgment. But I need to face them. Eliza said it quietly, but with steel underneath. I ran from London once, Adrian. I won't run again. These people saw me at my lowest. Let them see what I've become. So they accepted 3 invitations: a dinner at Lord Ashford's home, a garden party hosted by the Royal Agricultural Society, and a ball at the Pemberton estate. Calculated choices, each one a test of how far Eliza had truly come. Lord Ashford's dinner was first, the same Lord Ashford who'd taken Eliza's house in payment for her father's debts, the same Lord Ashford whose wife had been involved in the scandal that destroyed the Whitmore name. Are you certain about this? Lucas asked as they prepared to depart. Ashford's no friend to either of you. Which is exactly why we're going, Adrian said. If we can face him, we can face anyone. The Ashford residence was everything Blackthorn Hall wasn't. Warm, bright, filled with expensive art and expensive people drinking expensive wine. Eliza walked in on Adrian's arm, wearing a gown of deep emerald silk that she'd commissioned in London, the first truly new dress she'd owned in months. She looked every inch a duchess, and she felt every inch a fraud. But she held her head high and smiled as if she owned the room. Lord Ashford greeted them with the oily charm of a man who knew he held power. Duke Blackthorn, how delightful, and this must be your bride. My dear Duchess, I hope you've recovered from your recent difficulties. Completely, Eliza said smoothly. In fact, I should thank you, Lord Ashford. Taking my father's house forced me to rebuild my life. I'm far happier now than I ever was in that cold London townhouse. Ashford's smile tightened. He'd expected shame, perhaps tears, not gratitude delivered like a weapon. The dinner was excruciating. Conversation swirled around scandal and gossip. Who'd married whom, which families were rising or falling, whose investments had failed. Eliza felt eyes on her constantly, assessing, judging, waiting for her to make a mistake that would confirm their worst assumptions. Then Lady Ashford, the woman whose affair with Eliza's father had triggered the scandal, spoke across the table in a voice like poisoned honey. Tell me, Duchess, how are you finding married life? It must be quite different from what you expected, given the circumstances of your union. The table went silent. Every eye turned to Eliza. This was the moment. She could deflect, change the subject, pretend not to understand the barb, or she could tell the truth. You're absolutely right, Lady Ashford, Eliza said clearly. It's nothing like I expected. I married the Duke out of desperation. I had no money, no prospects, and no illusions about love. I signed a contract, climbed into his carriage, and prepared for a life of cold efficiency. She paused, meeting the woman's eyes. What I found instead was partnership, respect, and eventually, love. My husband is the finest man I've ever known, and I count myself extraordinarily fortunate. So, yes, it's quite different from what I expected. It's far, far better. Adrian's hand found hers under the table, squeezing gently. Lady Ashford's face went through several interesting colors before settling on pale fury. How charming! Though one does wonder what a man of the Duke's standing saw in a girl whose family name is synonymous with scandal. I saw courage, Adrian said quietly. His voice cut through the tension like a blade. I saw a woman who'd lost everything and refused to break, who faced down hostile servants, a bitter aunt, and a literal fire without flinching, who transformed a dying estate into something worth fighting for. He looked around the table, his gaze challenging. My wife is worth 10 of anyone in this room, including me. If you can't see that, the failure is yours, not hers. The silence that followed was absolute. Then Lord Pemberton, the magistrate, cleared his throat. I've heard remarkable things about your estate reforms, Duke. The profit-sharing model in particular sounds revolutionary. I'd love to hear more about the implementation. The conversation shifted and the crisis passed. But Eliza felt the shift in the room. These people might still gossip about her, might still judge, but they'd been forced to see her as something other than a scandal. Adrian had made sure of it. After dinner, as they waited for their carriage, Lady Pemberton approached Eliza with an expression of cautious respect. My dear Duchess, I must apologize. I was among those who questioned your husband's judgment in his choice of bride. But seeing you together, hearing him defend you, she paused. I was wrong. You're clearly a remarkable woman. I hope you'll forgive the discourtesy. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was acknowledgement, and that was enough. The garden party 2 days later was easier. The Royal Agricultural Society members were more interested in farming techniques than gossip, and Eliza found herself in genuine conversations about tenant welfare and sustainable land management. Several prominent landowners expressed interest in implementing similar reforms on their own estates. Your Grace, this profit-sharing system, one elderly earl said eagerly, does it truly increase productivity? Dramatically, Eliza confirmed. When workers have a stake in the harvest's success, they invest more care in every stage. We've seen yields increase by nearly 30%. Remarkable. And the education funds for workers' children? Isn't that rather radical? It's an investment in the future. Educated workers make better decisions, implement innovations, and stay loyal rather than seeking opportunities elsewhere. It's good business, not just charity. The Earl nodded thoughtfully. You make a compelling case, Duchess. Your husband is fortunate to have such an astute partner. Later, Adrian found her surrounded by a group of landowners, all clamoring for details about Blackthorn's reforms. He watched from a distance, a small smile playing at his lips. You're enjoying this, Lucas observed, appearing at his side. She's magnificent, Adrian said simply. Look at her. 3 months ago, these people would have cut her dead. Now they're hanging on her every word. Because she's earned it. You both have. Lucas paused. Are you nervous about the conference presentation? I'm never nervous. Liar. You're terrified that when you stand up there and tell the truth about how Blackthorn transformed, everyone will dismiss it as the ramblings of a duke who's gone soft. Adrian didn't deny it. I spent years building a reputation for ruthlessness. Now I'm advocating for compassion and partnership. It's a complete reversal. It's called growth, Lucas said. People respect that. And if they don't, at least you'll know you were honest. The conference was held in a grand hall in Westminster, filled with landowners, agricultural experts, and government officials interested in rural reform. Adrian and Eliza sat in the front row, waiting for their turn to present. Eliza's hands were clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. Breathe, Adrian murmured. You faced worse than a room full of pompous men in bad wigs. Have I, though? You faced me when I was at my worst. These people are amateurs. That startled a laugh out of her, and some of the tension eased. When their names were called, they walked to the podium together. Adrian had insisted on it. This presentation would be a partnership, just like everything else at Blackthorn. He began with the history, the estate in decline, the workers miserable and exploited, the yield dropping year after year. Then he handed the presentation to Eliza, who described the reforms they'd implemented. Her voice was steady, clear, filling the hall with the story of transformation. We started with a simple premise, she said. that the people who work the land deserve to share in its bounty, that education, housing, and fair treatment aren't charity. They're investments that pay returns for generations, that a lord's duty isn't to extract maximum profit, but to build sustainable prosperity for everyone under his care. She laid out the numbers, the increased yields, the reduced turnover, the improved quality of life metrics. She showed how profit sharing had created a workforce that cared about outcomes, how education funds had produced innovations that traditional management never would have found, how proper housing had reduced illness and increased productivity. The most remarkable thing, she concluded, is that these reforms don't just help the workers, they help the estate. Blackthorn is more profitable now than it's been in a decade, not despite treating people well, but because of it. Compassion and prosperity aren't enemies. They're partners. The hall was silent when she finished. Eliza's heart sank. She'd lost them. They thought she was naive or radical or... Then the applause started. One person, then another, then a wave that filled the hall with thunder. People stood, clapping, some actually cheering. The chairman of the Agricultural Society was beaming, and several government ministers were taking furious notes. Adrian stood beside her, his hand at the small of her back, his pride evident in every line of his body. "Well done," he murmured. "You just changed the conversation about rural reform in England." The rest of the conference was a blur of people wanting to shake their hands, ask questions, request detailed documentation of Blackthorn's methods. 3 different newspapers asked for interviews. A government minister invited them to consult on national agricultural policy. But the most meaningful moment came when an old man approached, someone Eliza didn't recognize, dressed in the rough clothes of a working farmer rather than a landowner. "Your Grace, he said to Eliza, his hat clutched in his hands. "I'm Samuel Winters. I tenant a small farm in Yorkshire. I just wanted to thank you for saying those things, for making them listen." "I'm glad the message resonated," Eliza said warmly. "It's more than resonance, ma'am. It's hope." His eyes were wet. "I've worked land for 40 years under lords who saw me as nothing but a tool. Hearing you say that we matter, that we deserve dignity, it means more than you know. You're giving voice to thousands of people who've never had one." Eliza felt her own throat tighten. "Then keep speaking, Mr. Winters. Tell your story. Make them listen. Change happens when enough people refuse to accept the old ways." He nodded, gripped her hand once, and disappeared back into the crowd. "You've started something," Adrian said quietly. "This won't stay contained to Blackthorn. Other estates will follow. The whole system might change." "Good. It should have changed years ago." The ball at the Pemberton estate was their final London engagement, and Eliza approached it with mixed feelings. She'd proven herself at the conference, yes, but a ball was different, pure society, pure judgment, with nothing to hide behind but manners and appearance. She wore a gown of midnight blue silk, her mother's restored wedding ring on her finger, and Adrian's love-like armor. When they entered the ballroom, conversation didn't stop, but it changed. Less gossip, more genuine interest. People wanted to meet the Duchess who'd captivated a conference full of experts, who'd transformed the feared Duke of Blackthorn into someone who smiled in public. Richard was there, her former fiancé. He approached with his wife, a pale, timid girl who looked terrified of her own shadow, and an expression of profound discomfort. "Eliza," he said, "forgive me, Duchess. I wanted to. That is, I should have—" "You should have nothing," Eliza said gently. "You made the choice you needed to make at the time. No apologies necessary. But I abandoned you when you needed help most." "You did. And that abandonment led me to Blackthorn Hall, to my husband, to a life I never would have found if you'd kept your promises." She smiled at him and meant it. "So thank you, Richard, for being too weak to stand by me. It was the best gift you could have given." He stared at her, clearly unsure if he'd been insulted or absolved. Eliza didn't particularly care which. She turned to Adrian, who was watching the exchange with amusement. "Dance with me?" she asked. "Always." They waltzed across the ballroom floor, and Eliza felt the weight of old fears finally lifting. These people had judged her, abandoned her, written her off as ruined, and she'd proven every single one of them wrong. Not by hiding or pretending to be someone else, but by being exactly who she was, brave, stubborn, and unwilling to accept that her circumstances defined her worth. "What are you thinking?" Adrian asked, spinning her through a turn. "That I'm happy. Genuinely, completely happy." She looked up at him. "When I climbed into your carriage that night, I thought I was trading one form of death for another. I never imagined I'd find life instead. We found it together. That's the only reason it worked." "No," Eliza said. "We created it together. There's a difference." The waltz ended, and they stood in the center of the ballroom, surrounded by people who'd once scorned them, and now watched with something like envy. Because what Adrian and Eliza had built, through fire and fear and fierce determination, was something rare, something precious, something worth fighting for. They left London 2 days later, bound for Blackthorn Hall, with a carriage full of correspondence from estates requesting consultations, newspapers wanting stories, and the Royal Agricultural Society asking Adrian to join their governing board. "You're going to be busy," Lucas observed, "changing the world, transforming rural England, becoming the face of compassionate estate management." "We're going to be busy," Adrian corrected. "None of this happens without Eliza." "I'm just the practical one," Eliza said. "You're the Duke. You have the platform. And you have the vision. We're partners, remember?" The journey home felt different from the journey out. Lighter somehow, as if they'd shed weight they hadn't known they were carrying. When Blackthorn Hall came into view, rebuilt, renewed, its windows blazing with welcoming light, Eliza felt something settle in her chest. Home. This was home. The staff greeted them with genuine warmth, gathering in the entrance hall to welcome the Duke and Duchess back. Harrison presented a summary of activities during their absence, all routine, all well managed. The estate had run smoothly without them because they'd built systems that worked, hired people they trusted, and created an environment where everyone had a stake in success. That night, standing at the window of their shared bedroom, looking out over grounds that were green with early summer growth, Eliza felt Adrian's arms come around her waist. "No regrets?" he asked quietly. "About what?" "Any of it. The desperate marriage, the contract, the fire, the battle with Constance, London." Eliza leaned back against him, considering. 5 months ago, she'd been starving in a cold house, abandoned by everyone, facing debtor's prison and disgrace. Now she stood in a beautiful home, married to a man she loved, having just addressed the Royal Agricultural Society and changed the conversation about rural reform across England. "No regrets," she said firmly. "Every awful moment led to this. I wouldn't change any of it. Even the parts where I was cold and distant and barely acknowledged your existence, especially those. They made the warmth mean something when it finally came." She turned in his arms to face him. "We weren't supposed to fall in love, Adrian, but we did anyway. Despite the contract, despite the circumstances, despite every reason it shouldn't have worked. That's the whole story, isn't it? Two broken people refusing to stay broken. Two broken people learning to build something whole." He kissed her forehead. "I have something to tell you." The seriousness in his tone made her nervous. "What?" "I've been thinking about the future, about legacy, about what we leave behind." He paused. "I want children, Eliza. Not because the contract requires an heir, but because I want to build a family with you. People who grow up knowing warmth instead of ice, who learn that strength means compassion, not cruelty, who carry forward what we've built here." Eliza felt tears prick her eyes. "I want that too. So much it terrifies me." "Then we'll be terrified together, like everything else." They stood at the window as night fell over Blackthorn Hall. Two people who'd started as strangers bound by desperation and had become partners bound by love. The house stretched around them, no longer a tomb, but a home. No longer cold, but warm with life and purpose and hope. In the gardens below, servants walked together, talking and laughing. In the kitchens, preparations were underway for tomorrow's meals. In the stables, horses settled for the night. Everything running smoothly, everyone cared for, the whole estate humming with the quiet satisfaction of work well done and lives well lived. This was the legacy they were building, not just profit or prestige, but a place where people mattered, where dignity and prosperity went hand in hand, where the ruthless Duke had learned to love and the desperate bride had learned to thrive. 3 years later, On a spring morning when the gardens exploded with color and life, Eliza stood in the nursery they'd built in the reconstructed south wing, bright and warm and filled with the kind of joy that Isabel's rooms had once held, and watched her husband play with their daughter. Catherine Isabel Blackthorne was 2 years old, all dark curls and fearless energy, currently attempting to climb her father like he was a particularly interesting tree. Adrian, the man who'd once been called the Ice Duke, was laughing as he pretended to be defeated by a toddler half his size. "She's going to be a terror," Lucas observed from the doorway, just like her mother. "I was never a terror," Eliza protested. "You faced down Constance, fought a fire, and reformed English agriculture. If that's not terrifying, I don't know what is." Adrian looked up, his daughter now perched triumphantly on his shoulders. "Any word from the Yorkshire estate?" "Mr. Winters writes that their first profit-sharing harvest was the most successful in 40 years. 3 neighboring estates have adopted the model." Lucas grinned. "Your revolution is spreading." "It's not a revolution, it's just basic human decency." "Same thing, apparently." Eliza crossed to the window, looking out over Blackthorn lands that now served as a model for estates across England. Delegations came monthly to observe their methods, interview their workers, study their success. The house that had once been a symbol of cold cruelty was now a beacon of what compassion and partnership could achieve. A letter had arrived that morning from the Prime Minister's office, requesting Adrian's consultation on national agricultural reform legislation. Another from America, where landowners were implementing Blackthorn-style tenant systems. The change they'd started was rippling outward, transforming lives far beyond their own estate. But Eliza's greatest pride wasn't in the recognition or the reforms. It was in the small moments, the servants who smiled instead of cowered, the children who ran laughing through halls that had once echoed with loneliness, the husband who'd learned to choose love over isolation, the daughter who would grow up knowing warmth instead of ice. This was the real victory. Not the speeches or the accolades, but the life they'd built from desperation's ashes. Adrian appeared beside her, Catherine still riding his shoulders, and slipped his free arm around Eliza's waist. "What are you thinking?" "That 5 years ago, I was starving in a frozen house with no future. And now?" She gestured to the room, the gardens, the estate stretching to the horizon. "Now I have everything I never dared to dream of." "We built it together," Adrian said quietly. "That's what makes it matter." Catherine chose that moment to grab her father's hair and demand to be taken to see the horses, and the serious moment dissolved into laughter and movement. But as they headed toward the stables, the whole family, Lucas trailing behind and making jokes, Eliza felt the truth of it settle in her bones. She'd come to Blackthorn Hall as a desperate bride with nothing to offer but survival. She'd left behind scandal and disgrace, poverty and despair. She'd fought for every inch of respect, every moment of warmth, every acknowledgement that she mattered. And in fighting, she'd won more than she could have imagined. Not just a husband or a title or security. She'd won partnership, love, a legacy that would outlive them all. The girl who'd climbed into a cold duke's carriage expecting death had instead found life. Fierce and beautiful and hard-won. And now, standing in the spring sunshine with her family around her and a future bright with promise stretching ahead, Eliza finally understood the truth she'd been too afraid to believe 5 years ago. Some battles aren't won with power or control. They're won by choosing to stay, to care, to love, despite the fear. By refusing to let cold and cruelty become inevitable. By building warmth in the darkest places and refusing to let go until the ice finally breaks. Blackthorn Hall stood behind them, no longer a prison, but a home. The estate spread before them, green and growing and alive, and in the distance, workers tended fields they had a stake in, lived in homes they could be proud of, raised children who would inherit not just land, but dignity. This was the legacy, not of the Ice Duke who'd terrorized London, but of 2 people who'd refused to let desperation define them, who'd chosen partnership over isolation, warmth over ice, life over mere survival. Eliza had traded freedom for survival in a desperate winter night 5 years ago. She'd found instead that freedom and survival weren't enemies at all. They were partners. just like everything else worth having in this beautiful, brutal, hard-won life. And as she watched her daughter laugh in the sunshine, her husband's hand warm in hers, their home blazing with light behind them, Eliza knew with absolute certainty that she'd make the same choice again, every single time. Because some gambles, the desperate, terrifying, impossible ones, pay dividends beyond measure. And love, hard won from the coldest soil, blooms all the brighter for the darkness it overcame.